think a cold is bad. Try coughing once in the Middle Ages and boom, you're bleeding chained up wearing a dead mole necklace. And maybe on fire. Think your life is hard. Try waking up in a cold, damp hut in the 14th century with a fever, a cough, and the unmistakable feeling that your spleen is trying to kill you. There's no doctor to call, no ibuprofen to take, and definitely no cosy chicken soup waiting in the kitchen. What you do have is a half-rotten turnip, a suspicious-looking goat, and a neighbour who believes your symptoms mean you've been cursed by an angry forest spirit. You're not going to the clinic, you're going to the priest. And if the priest isn't home, better start practicing your death groan. Let's get one thing straight, getting sick in the Middle Ages wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public spectacle with a 50-50 chance of you ending up in a shallow grave. In fact, you didn't even have to be that sick to die. Stubbed your toe, and it got infected. Congratulations, you now have 3 days to live. Caught a cold during a rainstorm, time to say goodbye to your loved ones and whisper a heartfelt apology to your pig. For most medieval people, illness was less about getting better and more about making peace with God. The medical theory of the time was charmingly incorrect. The dominant belief you had 4 bodily humours sloshing around inside you like a medieval smoothie blood phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Illness happened when they got out of balance, which, spoiler alert, was always. You could be too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, or if you were especially lucky, all 4 at once. The fix leeches. Always leeches. Now imagine being in a society where sneezing could be a religious experience. A sniffle wasn't just annoying, it could be a divine warning. People thought disease came from miasma or bad air, usually rising up from swamps, corpses, or that guy in the corner who hasn't bathed since the last crusade. Open wounds weren't covered, they were admired proof of your suffering and therefore your holiness. Smelling bad meant you were doing penance. Modern hygiene, that was suspiciously heretical. The poor had it worse, which is impressive considering the rich were also dying like flies. If you were a peasant and caught a fever, your options included praying drinking ale until you forgot what hurt or crawling into a ditch and waiting to meet the saints. Medicine was expensive and doctors preferred to treat the nobility anyway because they actually paid. You'd be lucky if someone remembered to cover your corpse with hay so the dogs didn't chew your toes off. But hey, maybe you had hope. Maybe you were lucky enough to live near a physician. A man who could read Latin owned a few dusty scrolls and once watched a pigeon sneeze. He'd show up with long robes, an even longer beard, and 0 helpful advice. Maybe he'd ask about your dreams. Maybe he'd taste your urine. Maybe he'd scream Saturn is angry and then prescribe a boiled onion tied to your forehead, and then he'd leave you to die with dignity and onion breath. The terrifying part is that many illnesses we consider trivial today, headaches, stomach bugs, a mild flu, were medieval death sentences. You got sick in the wrong season, and there was no food to help you recover. You got sick during a war, and your village doctor was out stabbing people with a sword. You got sick during a plague, and, well, we all know how that ended. Black pustules, choking on your own blood, your family burying you with a stick from a distance like you were radioactive. Even worse, you could survive the sickness and still be doomed. Scarring blindness, chronic pain, and social exile were the trophies of survival. In some cases, if you didn't die, people assumed you were a witch, because how else could you have avoided death? Congratulations, you beat the plague. Now prepare to be tied to a stake and set on fire for your insolent witchcraft. Medieval gratitude had a certain flair. There was no clear line between health and religion. Being sick meant you were either being punished by God or tested by him. Either way, your sin tally was being reviewed, and your best bet was repentance. Confess early, confess often, especially if you wanted to be buried inside the church walls instead of being dumped in a ditch full of other plague-riddled nobodies. Dying unshriven meant your soul might haunt your neighbours. Again, medieval healthcare was mostly crowd control for ghosts. Let's talk symptoms. Today you get a sore throat and it's annoying. In 1347, that sore throat could be bubonic plague dysentery, or just another excuse for your neighbour to accuse you of bringing death to the village. You coughed too loud, suspicious. Your eyes looked watery, definitely suspicious. You were suddenly too quiet, witch. Everything made you a witch, really, especially if you were a woman, or educated, or both. There were no thermometers and no blood tests and no x-rays. What you had was guesswork prayer and grandma's herbal soup, which may or may not include rat tail depending on what was in season. If your village had a wise woman, she might give you sage honey, or something called wormwood, which sounds like something found in Voldemort's spice rack. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it worked because the placebo effect is real. Sometimes you hallucinated and thought it worked because the wormwood was actually poisonous. Win-win. And don't forget the social cost. Being sick meant missing harvest, which meant starving later. It meant your children might die next because you were the one who usually kept them from licking infected livestock. It meant you'd be replaced by someone healthier, preferably with stronger arms and fewer boils. Communities were brutal about this stuff. If you couldn't contribute, you were expendable. If you were contagious, you were disposable. In some places, people literally locked the sick in their homes and burned the house down. Quarantine medieval style. Still want to complain about your head cold. At least now you can sit in bed, sip tea and binge medieval documentaries on a glowing screen that didn't require a candle or a dying scribe to produce. You can Google your symptoms, be convinced you're dying, then realise it's just dehydration and go back to sleep. You can walk into a pharmacy and buy meds that don't contain dried goat livers. You can see a doctor who has, qualifications. Nobody's prescribing leeches. Nobody's checking your humours. Nobody is blaming Mars for your migraines. Well, unless you're on TikTok. So the next time you sneeze and someone says bless, you know that once upon a time they actually meant it, because that sneeze could have been your last hurrah. In the Middle Ages, getting sick was less a speed bump and more a cliff edge. You didn't just hope to recover, you hoped your corpse wouldn't be stolen by grave robbers, or eaten by pigs, or tossed in a ditch next to that guy who died from hiccups. You've got tissues, Tylenol and reliable sewage systems. They had superstition suffering and a strong chance of turning into a cautionary tale. And if you think that's depressing, buckle up. We haven't even gotten to the part with leeches in your eyeballs yet. So you've started coughing up something green and chunky. Naturally your first thought isn't, I should hydrate, or maybe I need antibiotics. No, this is the 1300s. Your first thought is, which sin did I commit that made God this angry at my lungs? Because here's the cold, damp truth. Medical diagnosis in the Middle Ages wasn't a science. It was improv theatre with blood. And unfortunately, the doctor didn't know his lines. Let's start with the basics. If you were sick, your body was obviously out of balance. Not emotionally, not spiritually, humorally. That's right. Medieval medicine was based on the idea that your body was ruled by 4 magical fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They were like the 4 Hogwarts houses of pain. Feeling anxious. Too much yellow bile. Sad and constipated, blame the black bile. Sneezin' blood. That's probably Mars in retrograde. Seriously, they actually blamed astrology. Your medieval doctor, who was probably the only person in town who could spell his own name, would first examine your urine. Not in a lab, of course. No, he'd hold it up to the light like a connoisseur inspecting a fine wine. He might sniff it. He might taste it. He might declare it too damp, which is impressive because urine is literally liquid. Then he'd consult his book, usually a hand-copied crumbling manuscript written by a Greek who thought the brain cooled the blood and nod sagely, pretending he knew what any of this meant. If he was really thorough, he'd check your horoscope. Because nothing says serious medical professional like asking the stars if Mercury's mood swings are responsible for your boils. Astrology was baked into diagnosis. If the moon was in Scorpio and your spleen hurt, that made perfect sense. If Saturn was grumpy, that could explain your plague symptoms. In fact, some doctors wouldn't treat you at all if the planetary alignment wasn't favourable. Come back when Jupiter isn't being such a jerk. And if you're in and astrology didn't reveal the cause, don't worry, they'd simply ask you a series of deeply unhelpful questions. Have you been sleeping near a toad? Did you recently offend a saint? Have you eaten cheese during a full moon? Was your neighbour giving you dirty looks? Honestly, being accused of witchcraft was often a better diagnosis than your humours are feuding again. At least then you knew what to expect: fire. Physical examinations weren't a thing unless the symptom was screamingly obvious. Broken leg. They could see that. Your insides rotting from a fever too abstract. Medieval doctors had no stethoscopes, no thermometers, and no shame. They relied on guesswork, instinct, and sometimes dreams. Literally, they believed you could dream the cause of your illness and the cure. If you dreamed of fish, maybe you needed more water. If you dreamed of fire, they might throw you in a cold pond to balance your inner flame. If you dreamed of flying, well, time to call the priest. Let's not forget pulse reading. This was the closest thing to actual medicine they had, but they still managed to ruin it. Instead of just checking if your heart was beating fast, they'd count how many times it pulsed in the span of a prayer. Then they'd compare it to what Galen wrote in 200 AD while dissecting monkeys. Spoiler, it didn't help. If your pulse was too slow, they'd warm you up with mustard baths. If too fast, they'd bleed you. Either way, you were losing blood. Fast. And the charts. Oh, the glorious charts. Medieval doctors loved making charts that looked like demonic bingo cards. They'd map body parts to planets, seasons, elements, and biblical sins. Did you know your liver was ruled by Jupiter and springtime and hope? Your gallbladder, that was pure Mars angry red and totally not responsible for your digestive issues. These charts were more complicated than they were helpful, but they looked impressive while your leg was rotting. Sometimes they'd send you to a specialist. Not a better doctor, just a different flavour of confusion. Maybe the barber surgeon could take a look. Maybe the apothecary had a potion involving bat wings and mint. Maybe the village herb witch could wave a smudge stick and chant until you felt mildly better or unconscious, whichever came first. Everyone had an opinion and none of them were right. But they all charged something, even if it was just 3 chickens and your dignity. Let's be clear, medieval diagnosis wasn't about helping the patient. It was about sounding smart while the patient died slightly slower. There were entire schools that taught how to make educated guesses in Latin. They'd teach you how to write a prescription that looked like a spell and smelled like regret. You'd learn to quote Hippocrates and Avicenna without actually understanding a single word they meant. It was academic LARPing, and people were dying on the daily. Of course, some patients was diagnosed simply by smell. If you smelled bad enough, it meant death was near. The problem: everyone smelled bad. Soap was rare, bathing was suspicious, and deodorant was a fantasy from the devil. So when someone really stank, it was like a bat signal for the priest to start reciting last rites. Imagine dying just because you sweated more than usual during a heat wave. That was real. That happened. And then there was the screaming. Not from the doctors unless they accidentally bled themselves with their rusty tools, but from the patients, whose diagnoses often came with treatments involving knives fire or prayer circles. Some were tied down, some were dunked in ice water, some were exorcised. Many just screamed because being told your headache was the result of sin and too much thinking wasn't helpful, especially when the solution was stop thinking forever. And if you were misdiagnosed, tough. There was no malpractice insurance, no second opinion, no online review to leave a salty comment. If you lived, the doctor was a genius. If you died well, you probably deserved it for having impure thoughts. Diagnosis was less about healing and more about assigning blame. You were either too lustful, too gluttonous, or just plain unlucky. Either way, it was your fault. Medieval medicine had zero chill. Let's pause to appreciate how far we've come. Today, if you have chest pain, you get an ECG blood test and possibly a helicopter ride. Back then, they'd check your tongue, throw some herbs in a pot and mutter something about overheating your inner bile. You could be having a heart attack and their advice would be, sit near a cold rock and eat pears. The scientific method hadn't been invented, but random guesses they were thriving, and still people believed. Because what else was there? Death was everywhere and hope was cheap. A wrong diagnosis was still a chance, and sometimes people did recover either by luck, immunity or stubbornness. When they did, it wasn't thanks to the doctor. It was thanks to God or saints or the full moon being in a forgiving phase. The diagnosis might have been nonsense, but it gave people something to hold on to while everything else fell apart. So next time your doctor runs a full blood panel, checks your vitals and prescribes you something that actually works, maybe say a little thank you to the 14th century guy who got diagnosed with too much wind and died chewing dried lizard tongue. He walked so you could run straight to urgent care where the magazines are outdated but the leeches are blessedly gone. Imagine this. You're coughing up black bile, your armpits are swelling like demonic fruit, and your neighbours are giving you the look usually reserved for rotting livestock. There's a knock on the door, not from your local priest or concerned cousin, but from a man in a long, dark cloak with a mask shaped like a bird's face. He looks like a villain from a Tim Burton fever dream, and his very presence screams, "Well, you're screwed." That, my friend, is the medieval version of a house call. And if he's at your door, your chances of surviving have officially dropped lower than a peasant's dental hygiene. The infamous plague doctor outfit was less about style and more about survival panic masquerading as fashion. The beaked mask. It wasn't for intimidation, though it certainly did the job. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and occasionally a lucky frog foot, anything to mask the stench of death, which in a plague-ridden city was basically the background scent. They believed that bad smells caused disease miasma theory, so naturally if you shoved lavender up your nose and wore leather from head to toe you could dodge death like a medieval ninja. Unfortunately, the disease didn't get that memo. These so-called doctors weren't exactly creme de la creme of the medical world. In fact, many of them weren't doctors at all. Some were failed surgeons, bored monks, or desperate men looking for a paycheck, and some light apocalypse cosplay. Being a plague doctor was considered such a suicide mission that cities had to offer hazard pay housing and occasionally pardons for crimes to get anyone to sign up. That's right, some plague doctors were literal criminals in costume. Imagine getting your buboes examined by Steve the arsonist. Let's talk about those buboes, shall we? They were the painful, swollen lymph nodes, usually under the arm's neck or groin, that looked like someone tried to grow an eggplant inside your body. They stank, they oozed, and they hurt like medieval hell. Plague doctors would sometimes lance them, meaning they'd slice them open to let the pus out. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a sharp knife and some vague hope. Best case scenario, you screamed a lot and still died 3 days later. Their tools looked like something out of a torture museum. Long wooden canes were used to poke patients from a distance because touching was too risky. The cane also came in handy for beating off desperate crowds and nudging unconscious bodies to see if they were still worth treating. Leather gloves, goggles, and a full-body waxed robe completed the outfit. They basically looked like a horror film's idea of a beekeeper with boundary issues, and they were still more helpful than the guy prescribing urine smoothies. In terms of actual treatment, let's just say they tried. Some recommended bloodletting because apparently losing blood helps with organ failure. Others offered concoctions of mercury arsenic or plague water, which was just wine with a few corpses worth of herbs steeped in it. The good news, you might get drunk enough to forget you were dying. The bad news, you'd still die, with a hangover, in your neighbour's wheelbarrow. Public health strategy was, to put it gently, a mess. Cities tried quarantine by literally walling people inside their homes. If one family member showed symptoms, the whole household was locked in. No escape, no exception. They'd mark the doors with red crosses and maybe leave a loaf of bread outside if the city felt generous that week. Basically, medieval quarantine was a countdown to group funeral, and if the family dog barked too loudly, he got bricked in too. No survivors, no whining. The death tolls were biblical. We're talking about a third of Europe's population disappearing in the span of a few years. Entire villages went silent. Fields were left unharvested. Cats got promoted to pest control officers, and rats hosted the worst dinner party in human history. And through it all, the plague doctors waddled from house to house like harbingers of doom, trailing their flower-scented death behind them. People feared them, respected them, avoided them, and occasionally tried to kill them just to see if it helped. The psychological toll was nightmarish. If you saw a plague doctor on your street, it meant your time was up. Parents abandoned children. Lovers fled from each other. Priests refused last rites. Society didn't just collapse, it clawed at itself while sobbing in a bucket of rosemary water. And the doctors, despite their terrifying get-ups, were also victims. Many got infected. Many died. Some simply vanished. Whether they succumbed to illness or ran off with a farmer's goat, we'll never know. But hey, let's talk about the silver lining if we can find one under this pile of festering corpses. The plague, horrific as it was, forced people to ask questions. Why were so many dying? Why didn't the old remedies work? Why did astrology fail us? These weren't just screams of grief. They were the early grumbles of science waking up. Slowly, groggily, still covered in boils, but waking up nonetheless. The beaked mask itself became a symbol of fear of failure, of flawed understanding, and yet it also represented the first clumsy steps toward personal protective equipment. In their own misguided way, plague doctors tried to prevent infection. They weren't always effective, but they weren't entirely useless either. And in a time when most people thought diseases were divine punishments for lusty thoughts that's saying something, of course some people blamed the plague on Jews, witches, foreigners, and even cats. Yes, cats. They were killed in massive numbers for allegedly spreading disease, ironically making things worse, since rats, the real culprits, now had free rein. This is medieval logic in a nutshell. Everything's dying. Let's murder something random and hope God notices. In many towns, that meant persecution, pogroms, and absolute moral collapse. Humanity failed spectacularly. The doctors just happened to be wearing bird masks while it happened. So next time you see someone in an N95 mask, don't laugh. Be grateful. They're not wielding a stick. They probably didn't spend the morning tasting your pee. They don't think Saturn is responsible for your rash, and they don't arrive on horseback with a sack of leeches and a will written in Latin. Modern doctors have access to microscopes, vaccines, and actual medical training, not just a suspiciously inherited beak costume and a degree in general vibes. And you can catch a mild cold, get tested, take pills, and recover without your town forming a funeral parade. You can cry about your fever without being walled into your bedroom with a loaf of bread and a rat. You can get better. That wasn't a guarantee back then. In fact, it was a miracle. So bless the plague doctor not for curing anyone but for trying. For walking into the horror mask on stick in hand and facing down death armed with herbs and hope. They didn't save the world, but they showed up anyway. Which, let's be honest, is more than most of us would do in a leather oven suit. So you've survived the visit from the plague doctor. Congrats! You're not dead yet, though the smell says otherwise. And now it's time to try something even more questionable medicine. Real, actual, handcrafted medieval medicine. If by medicine you mean a hellish cocktail of animal parts, herbs and crushed human bones all jammed into a wooden jar and called a cure. Welcome to the medieval apothecary part, pharmacy part, kitchen part, haunted cabinet of curiosities. Picture a dim little shop that smells like mildew, death, and optimism. Glass vials, bone jars, mummified toads, maybe a desiccated hand for good measure, all lined up like trophies of failed science. There's a mortared chunk of unicorn horn which was just narwhal tusk, a basket of dried beetles and a bag labelled dragon's blood which is somehow neither dragon nor blood. The apothecary himself looks like he hasn't slept since the last harvest, and wears robes permanently stained with regret. His tools include a pestle, a long list of dead customers, and absolutely no medical license. You're handed a remedy with a name like Blessed Liver Tonic or Bishop's Delightful Healing Syrup, and you try not to ask too many questions. What's in it? Oh, just a dash of powdered skull, a few drops of snake oil, maybe some mould scraped from bread that fell behind the altar last month. If you're lucky, the worst it'll do is make you vomit. If you're not well, let's just say you'll be meeting St. Peter with garlic breath and a mysterious rash. But at least it was natural. Herbal medicine was the star of the show, and by herbal we mean every plant anyone ever saw regardless of whether it was actually helpful. Got a fever? Try fennel and foxglove. Trouble sleeping? A nice tea made from lettuce and lead shavings should do it. You've been possessed by demons, time to smoke some henbane and see where that rabbit hole goes. For every effective remedy like willow bark, the ancient ancestor of aspirin, there were 5 others that were just poison with better branding. Animal ingredients were where things got particularly horrifying. Ground-up mouse was considered good for earaches. Burnt peacock droppings helped with headaches. Boiled badger fat was for bruises. Dried toad powder cured everything from warts to melancholy. And if you were really in a bind, you could smear goose dung across your chest for pneumonia. It didn't work, but you'd be too embarrassed to keep complaining, so technically the apothecary cured you. And let's not forget the human ingredients. Because yes, cannibalism was low-key a medical trend. Powdered mummy, often imported from Egypt, was believed to have magical curative powers. It was added to tonics and pills and occasionally sprinkled on bread like some kind of necrotic oregano. Human fat was applied topically for joint pain. Human blood, especially from a recently executed criminal, was thought to restore youth and vigour. Nothing says health and wellness like sipping a cup of executioner's brew with your morning barley. Of course, no medieval medicine was complete without religious flair. Some ingredients were blessed by monks, others were mixed on holy days for added effect. There were pills shaped like crosses and potions stirred while reciting prayers. One recipe advised mixing herbs only when the moon is full and the rooster has crowed 3 times. Another involved writing the Lord's Prayer on a piece of parchment and eating it. You weren't just curing a cough, you were throwing a Hail Mary at your own bloodstream. Dosing was also a carnival of chaos. Take a spoonful meant whatever your nearest spoon could carry, even if that spoon was used to stir pig slop earlier. Apply liberally could result in either mild relief or full body paralysis. Instructions like until improvement were dangerously optimistic, and side effects. If you lived, they were considered irrelevant. Most cures were judged not by how they worked, but by how dramatic they felt. sweating uncontrollably. Perfect. That means the demons are leaving through your pores. The apothecary didn't just deal with the sick, he also did a thriving side business in poisons. After all, what's the difference between a cure and a curse when your ingredient list includes belladonna arsenic and crushed beetle shells? Poisoning someone was often just a matter of slightly misreading a prescription. It was the Middle Ages version of pharmaceutical error, except instead of a lawsuit you just buried the evidence, preferably in a different village. Apothecaries also doubled as early pharmacists, barkeepers and gossip hubs. Want the latest news about whose rash looks most suspicious? He's your guy. Need a little something to help your neighbour sleep forever. Also your guy. They operated in that magical intersection of helpful, dangerous and vaguely illegal. And with no FDA to stop them, they sold everything from love potions to miracle cures to whatever sludge they found fermenting behind the chicken coop. And the people kept coming. 'Cause what else could they do? You're a peasant with a rotting foot and no understanding of bacteria. You've tried praying, you've tried fasting, you even sacrificed a chicken twice. At this point, if someone hands you a jar of powdered bat spleen and says, "Drink this at sunset while facing east, you're going to do it." Hope is powerful, even when it smells like rotten onions and fish bile. Some remedies did have merit though, usually by accident. Garlic had antimicrobial properties. Honey helped wounds heal. Charcoal could absorb toxins. But for every good idea, there were 100 bad ones involving crushed gemstones, spiderwebs, or unicorn ashes. Trial and error was the name of the game. Mostly error, followed by dying. Followed by your apothecary quietly crossing your name off the loyal customers list. The worst part. Most of these concoctions weren't cheap. You'd trade food, animals, or land just to buy a tiny vial of something that might be dried cow spit. The wealthy got premium ingredients like bezoars from goats' stomachs, which supposedly neutralized poison. The poor got mouldy herbs and expired pig marrow. Either way you paid. Not just in money, but in pain, confusion, and often explosive diarrhea. But hey, if your insides were leaving your body, that meant something was happening right. So next time you walk into a pharmacy and pick up your neatly labelled bottle of medicine complete with ingredients, you can actually spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. The ones who rubbed cat fat on their chests and drank vinegar laced with crushed beetles. The ones who cured headaches with mercury and morning prayers. The ones who walked into the apothecary with a toothache and walked out the potion that doubled as paint thinner. They weren't stupid. They were desperate. And in a world where death was always crouching just outside your door, sometimes drinking mummified kings with your beer sounded like a decent plan. At least until your liver gave up. And even then there was probably a potion for that too, labelled liver rejuvenation tincture now with extra snake. You wake up with a pounding headache, chills, and the vague sensation that your bones are trying to escape your body. Congratulations, you've been diagnosed with something. Doesn't matter what. Because in medieval medicine, no matter the illness, there was one universal treatment. Fever bleeded out. Coughing blood bleeded out faster. Lost a toe to frostbite, you guessed it, better get the leeches. Bloodletting wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a lifestyle choice. It was the turn it off and on again of medieval healthcare. People believed that illness came from an imbalance in the four humours, and the fastest way to restore that sacred internal harmony was to drain your veins like a stuck pig. Too much blood was the go-to explanation for everything from indigestion to insanity. Feeling weak, you probably had excess vitality. The solution: drain it. Obviously. Now this wasn't some delicate little finger prick. No. We're talking about opening up veins with knives razors, or whatever blade was on hand. You'd lie there arm outstretched while a man with zero regard for cleanliness carved into your flesh like he was prepping a chicken dinner. The blood would pour into a bowl which they usually kept and examined like a fine bottle of wine. Hints of despair with an oaky finish. Definitely a spleen imbalance. And if you were lucky, you got the deluxe version leeches, nature's little vampires. These slimy critters were stored in jars, occasionally starved to make them extra hungry, then slapped onto your body to suck out your troubles literally. There was no real science behind where they were placed. Some went on your temples, some went near your genitals, some were just dropped on you like creepy little question marks. If they fell off, it meant the bad blood was gone. If they kept sucking well, you probably deserved it. Of course, the bleeding wasn't random. It was thematically random. There were charts showing which veins to open for which ailments. Headache, try the temple. Liver problems, go for the arm. Bad dreams. Obviously slice the ankle. These charts were more confusing than IKEA instructions and often based on the planetary alignment. If Mars was being moody and Venus was flirting with Jupiter, maybe it was a good time to open your leg and drain a pint. Astrology metanatomy in a blood-splattered disaster. Let's talk logistics. Bloodletting tools weren't exactly state-of-the-art. You had fleams, which were sharp metal instruments designed to slice, quickly and deeply, basically medieval box cutters. There were also scarificators, which sound like medieval Pokemon but were actually terrifying devices with multiple blades. One good press and schlick your skin became a leaky faucet. And remember, no gloves, no soap, no antiseptics. If the bleeding didn't cure you, the infection would. Medieval win-win. The best part. They didn't stop at just one session. Oh no, you'd come in with a fever and the physician would bleed you. If your condition worsened, as it usually did, they'd say, clearly we haven't bled you enough. So they'd bleed you again and again until your complexion matched your bedsheets and your spirit was floating above your body whispering, I told you this was a bad idea. But by then the doctor was too busy sharpening his tools for round 4. Children weren't spared either. Infants with colic drain a few drops. Teenagers with acne time to slice open a vein. The logic was that everyone had too much blood unless proven otherwise. It was like medieval Marie Kondo, if it doesn't spark joy, let it out through the elbow. And nothing sparks less joy than blood loss during a fever. Bloodletting was also a spectator event. Sometimes patients were bled in public squares. It was entertainment. People gathered to watch the noble art of exsanguination, like it was the Middle Ages answer to daytime television, and the doctors, they wore fancy robes and used gold-plated bowls, because if you're going to hemorrhage to death, you might as well do it with a little flair. But the true comedy or tragedy was that this practice lasted for centuries. Even when people began suspecting it didn't work, they just doubled down. Oh, you died after 3 bloodlettings, should have tried 5. It took over 500 years for the medical world to collectively realize that draining people like wine barrels might not be the best path to healing. But by then, generations had already bled their way into early graves. For science. Or something pretending to be science. Let's not forget who received the most bleeding, the wealthy. Rich folks loved a good bloodletting. It was trendy, fashionable. The Renaissance equivalent of a juice cleanse. Kings and queens scheduled regular drainings to rebalance themselves. Some even had personal leech collections like deranged Pokemon trainers. It wasn't just medicine, it was a status symbol. Because nothing says nobility like voluntary anemia. Now here's the kicker. Occasionally bleeding did help. Not because the theory was correct, but because some conditions like high blood pressure or polycythemia actually benefited from fluid loss. But those were happy accidents, tiny victories buried under an ocean of unnecessary suffering. It's like fixing your computer by smashing it with a rock and claiming success when it reboots out of fear. Still the practice endured. It endured despite mountains of corpses, despite rising skepticism, despite the occasional patient turning ghost white and falling over mid-drain. The reason doctors couldn't let go, literally, they had nothing else. No germ theory, no antibiotics, no understanding of the body beyond squishy parts plus invisible sins. Death. Blood was visible. Bleeding was doing something. And in the face of chaos action, however stupid, felt like control. So next time you feel faint at the sight of a needle, think of your ancestors. Think of them lying in smoky rooms, veins open, wondering if the dizziness meant it was working or just the end. Think of leeches wriggling happily as they drank your grandfather's elbow. Think of physicians quoting Aristotle while your cousin bled out in a wooden chair. Think of how far we've come, and then hug your antibiotics, or at least your doctor, and whisper thank you for not stabbing me. So let's say you've managed to survive the fever, the bloodletting, and the herbal sludge brewed in a goat bladder. Miraculous. But now your leg's turning black, smells like betrayal, and buzzes with flies. That means it's time for surgery, an experience best described as scream, now thank them never. Because in the Middle Ages, surgery wasn't a sterile, careful science. It was a bloody street performance with tools that looked suspiciously like gardening equipment. And if you were conscious during it, which you absolutely were, you'd remember every horrifying second until your dying breath, which usually came before lunch. Anesthesia didn't exist. Let's just rip that band-aid off, unlike your infected skin, which they'd probably try to keep. You didn't get numbing cream gas or even the courtesy of someone knocking you out with a rock. If you were lucky, you got a rag soaked in wine. If you were very lucky, the wine was strong enough to make you forget your own name, while a man in an apron sawed off your leg with the enthusiasm of a woodcutter on bonus pay. Pain wasn't just expected, it was confirmation that you were alive. For now. The operating room, try a tavern table, a church bench, or the dirt floor of a barn. Cleanliness was optional. Tools were wiped on aprons, dipped in dirty water, or occasionally just shared between patients like some sort of medieval friendship bracelet. Blood spattered everywhere. Infection was as inevitable as regret. The patient was often held down by family members, or if you were important enough, by assistants paid to ignore your screams, while pretending this was all perfectly normal. The surgeons themselves were not what you called gentle hands. In fact, for most of medieval Europe, surgeons weren't even considered real doctors. They were barbers. That's right. Your local haircut guy also moonlighted as a one-man butcher shop. He'd give you a trim, pull your tooth, lance your abscess, and amputate your arm all before lunch. The iconic barber pole, red and white. That's not just for show. It symbolizes blood and bandages. Medieval branding was honest. Let's talk technique. If your arm was gangrenous, they'd tie a tourniquet above the site, heat up an iron rod until it glowed like the wrath of God, then saw through the flesh, muscle, and bone as fast as humanly possible. Speed was essential. The longer they took, the more you screamed, thrashed, and bled. Once the limb was off, they'd press the hot iron to the stump, cauterizing the wound in a sizzling cloud of burnt meat and agony. If you passed out from the pain, great. If you didn't, you probably wished you had. Surgical tools were not refined. The scalpel looked like a knife stolen from a butcher's kitchen. Bone saws were just saws. Hooks, tongs, spikes, hammers, if it could pierce, pry, or pound, it had a place in the medical kit. There were also strange devices like trephines used to drill holes in your skull to release the bad spirits, causing headaches or madness. The result, infection coma, or a sudden and dramatic career shift to corpse. And don't expect any post-op care. There were no antibiotics, no clean dressings, no nurses to monitor your vitals. If you survived the surgery, you were dumped onto a flea-infested bed and told to pray. Maybe someone would smear honey or pig fat on the wound. Maybe they'd recite a few psalms while your stitches festered. Maybe you'd hallucinate yourself into thinking you were recovering. But statistically, you were on a one-way trip to Gangrene City. Even childbirth could turn into a makeshift surgery with horrifying results. Caesarean sections were a death sentence. Performed only when the mother was already dying or dead, they involved slicing open the abdomen like you were gutting a fish and hoping a crying baby flopped out. Sterility. Not a thing. And if the baby survived, they were considered lucky. If the mother survived, it was a miracle, a scandal, or both. Let's not ignore the psychological toll. Surgery wasn't just physical trauma, it was mental obliteration. The fear leading up to it could send people into delirium. Some patients ran away, some begged for death beforehand. Some were held down and gagged as a priest stood nearby murmuring prayers and pretending this was helping. And in many cases, surgery wasn't the last resort, it was the only resort. Either I lose the leg or I lose everything, they'd whisper. And often, they lost both. Of course, the church had opinions. They considered blood sacred and therefore slicing it open somewhat blasphemous. That's why most actual physicians, the university-trained book-reading ones, refused to operate. It was beneath them. Too messy, too sinful. So they left the gore to the barbers who never studied a day of anatomy but had excellent knife skills. It's like asking your tattoo artist to do your appendix. Except there's more screaming and less regret afterward. Maybe. Oddly enough, there were some rare success stories. A soldier might survive an amputation and go on to live a long peg-legged life full of trauma and strange weather predictions. A lucky patient might get a clean cut, a strong immune system, and a surprisingly good set of guardian angels. But for every miracle, there were 100 horror stories people carved open for boils, bladder stones, or weird lumps that nobody understood. Exploratory surgery back then meant exploring in the most literal and reckless sense of the word. Now imagine all this happening without a single medical textbook based on real anatomy. They didn't know about germs, they didn't understand how organs worked. Half the human body was a mystery, the other half a theological debate. Surgeons just cut what looked bad and hoped the bleeding stopped eventually. Autopsies were rare and often illegal. Dissections happened in secret. If someone wrote down what they learned, the church might burn them for witchcraft. And that's assuming the ink didn't smear from all the blood. So yes, if you were facing surgery, you were brave or desperate, you had to be. It wasn't about healing, it was about survival, buying a little more time or cutting out the rot before it spread to your soul. Pain was inevitable. Recovery was mythical, gratitude was unlikely. But the alternative was watching yourself rot alive while your family argued over who'd inherit your shoes. Next time you complain about waiting 30 minutes in a modern hospital with climate control work in plumbing and a vending machine, remember your ancestors. Remember the man who got his leg sawed off on a wooden table while screaming into a pillow made of straw. Remember the woman who gave birth surrounded by candles, nuns, and death. Remember the surgeon who used the same blade for 3 different people in one afternoon. And remember this. You have anesthesia. They had God. Tooth pain. A modern annoyance easily solved with a dentist, some numbing gel, and maybe a sticker if you're brave. But in the Middle Ages, toothache wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a divine punishment sent straight from the heavens to humble you into submission, or possibly a demon gnawing on your jawbone. Either way, if your molars started throbbing, you had 2 choices: suffer until your head exploded, or visit the local tooth yanker. Spoiler, neither ended with you smiling. Dental care in the Middle Ages was an oxymoron. There was no brushing, no flossing, no fluoride. The closest thing to oral hygiene was rinsing your mouth with wine and pretending the pain was a test of character. Teeth rotted fast and often. Sugar wasn't even widespread yet, so you can thank mostly beer bread and bacteria for the dental disasters of the time. and when that inevitable infection arrived, your gum line wasn't just inflamed, it was actively plotting your death. Now, who exactly took care of teeth? Not dentists, they didn't exist. Your options were the local barber surgeon, a blacksmith with strong wrists, or that one guy in the market with rusty tools and poor impulse control. He was known as the tooth drawer, a cheerful soul who pulled teeth for coin for fun, or because he liked the screaming. There were no dental licenses, no x-rays, no informed consent. You sat down, opened wide, and hoped he didn't grab your nose by mistake. The tools, straight-up nightmare fuel. Imagine a pair of oversized pliers that looked like they were stolen from a medieval torture chamber. Some were shaped like claws, others like tiny meat hooks. There were also tooth-keys iron instruments that twisted into your gums and yanked the tooth out sideways like opening a wine bottle full of blood and regret. No gloves, no antiseptic, just spit sweat and the metallic smell of your own future trauma. You weren't offered anesthesia. Instead, they offered strong ale a stick to bite down on, and perhaps a prayer if they were feeling generous. The goal was speed, get in, grab, the tooth get out before the patient kicked you. Screaming was expected, crying was standard, fainting was common, and if your tooth broke mid-extraction, they'd just keep digging until they got the rest, or until you passed out, or until they hit bone and shrugged. Let's not forget the medieval belief that worms lived in teeth. Yes, tiny invisible worms burrowing into your molars and causing pain by wiggling. This delightful theory was popular for centuries. Some treatments involved trying to coax the worms out using heat herbs or magical chants. Others involved smoking them out by blowing hot vapours into your mouth. That's right, someone would literally blow smoke into your face to evict imaginary worms from your jaw. If that didn't work, well, time to grab the pliers again. And hygiene. Don't make me laugh. The same pliers used on you were used on the guy before you, who may or may not have died screaming. Instruments were rarely cleaned, and when they were, it usually involved a quick wipe on the sleeve or a rinse in lukewarm blood water. Infections were almost guaranteed. People didn't worry about germs because germs weren't invented yet. Your mouth would swell, ooze and rot, but hey, at least the tooth wasn't hurting anymore. If the infection spread, there were no root canals, no antibiotics, no gentle consultations. You'd be told to pray harder, sleep less, and maybe bleed from the foot to rebalance your energies. Sometimes the swelling would grow so large that it closed the throat or invaded the brain. Death by toothache wasn't just possible, it was disturbingly common. All because your molar decided to betray you with a bit of medieval gangrene. And let's not forget public tooth pulling. Yes, this wasn't always done in private. Travelling tooth drawers performed in marketplaces, setting up booths next to the pie vendors and pig auctions. They'd call over crowds, crack jokes, yank teeth and hold them up like trophies. Blood would fly, people would cheer. Sometimes the tooth drawer dressed in bright colours to make the whole scene feel more festive. It was medicine meets carnival horror show. Of course, people tried home remedies first. Some rubbed crushed sage on their gums. Others stuffed cloves in their cheeks or held warm vinegar in their mouths while reciting psalms. One recipe suggested stuffing your mouth with roasted onions and sleeping with your head over a beehive, presumably to distract you with the constant fear of being stung to death. Another said to write a magical charm on a scrap of paper and burn it under the moonlight while rubbing your jaw with toad fat. Did it work? No, but it beat facing the pliers. Tooth replacements were also a thing, but not in the way you'd hope. If you lost too many teeth, you could fashion false ones out of wood ivory, or even teeth taken from corpses. That's right, second-hand dentures straight from the battlefield. Wealthy nobles sometimes had golden caps made not for health, but for vanity. They couldn't chew anything, but at least they sparkled while sipping thin soup. Meanwhile, peasants just gummed their bread and hoped they wouldn't choke on a crust. There were also beliefs that toothaches were punishment for sins. Lust, gluttony, envy, pick your poison. If your molars throbbed, it meant your soul was out of balance. Some thought confessing could help. Others believed holy relics could ease the pain. Pilgrims would crawl for miles just to kiss the toe of a dead saint in the hope it would cure their abscess. Miracles were rare, but desperation was not, and yet tooth drawers remained in business. People kept lining up coin in hand, mouth trembling, not because they trusted the man with the pliers, but because the pain was worse. Toothache in the Middle Ages was like living with a wasp in your skull, constant buzzing and deeply personal. Sometimes ripping it out, even at the cost of your jaw, felt like mercy. Screaming in the street was better than screaming alone. So next time your dentist offers you a little shot of lidocaine before filling a cavity, say thank you. Say it twice. Say it with flowers. You're lying on a sterile chair under soft lighting, listening to instrumental jazz. Your biggest concern is whether the drill will tickle. Meanwhile, your ancestors were clenching their teeth in a wooden vice while a man in blood-soaked robes muttered about worms and yanked their molars with blacksmith tools. You get numbing gel. They got a splintered jaw and the smell of copper in their nostrils. And if that doesn't make you want to floss tonight, nothing will. Let's get one thing clear: when you hear the word hospital, you probably think of clean sheets, helpful nurses, and maybe the sound of a blood pressure cuff inflating gently on your arm. In the Middle Ages, the word hospital meant something entirely different. It meant prayers, moaning rats the size of cats, and a mattress made from hay fleas and low expectations. Hospitals weren't places to get better, they were places to go die more politely, and sometimes not even that politely. Medieval hospitals were run mostly by the church. That sounds comforting until you realise that monks and nuns were trained in theology, not triage. Their primary treatment method: prayer. Lots and lots of prayer. You showed up with a fever and Brother Elias would ask how your soul was doing. If your soul felt fine, they figured your body was the problem and maybe it needed to suffer more to get holy. Forget privacy. Patients were crammed into long open halls, dozens of bodies in various stages of decay, arranged like overripe fruit at a market stall. Curtains, not a chance. Clean linens, if you were royalty. Everyone else lay on shared bedding that hadn't been washed since the last bishop was excommunicated. And don't even ask about pillows. Your options were either a chunk of straw or the damp shoulder of the person dying next to you. Hope you like the sound of coughing, because that was your lullaby. You might think these hospitals were for the sick. Not really. Many were built for pilgrims, the poor or the elderly. Basically, people society didn't know what to do with. You got food, shelter, and a monk to mumble over you, but if you had the plague, good luck. The only treatment was isolation, usually in a side building called the pest house. It had all the warmth and hospitality of an abandoned chicken coop, except with more weeping. The most common medication soup. That's right, watery, lukewarm onion adjacent liquid was the elixir of life, served daily regardless of your illness. Broken leg soup. Lung full of pus soup with bread. Hallucinating demons crawling out of your ears. Double soup. It wasn't healing you, but it kept you busy chewing while your condition quietly worsened. Nutrition was viewed as comfort, not cure. You didn't eat to get better. You ate because dying on an empty stomach was considered rude. Now let's talk about hygiene, or rather the complete and utter absence of it. Puss wasn't cleaned, it was blessed. Wounds were wrapped in the same cloth used to scrub the floor. Bedpans, when they existed, were used sparingly. Many patients relieved themselves where they lay. And when someone died, which was often, their body was sometimes left in place for hours or even days until a friar had time to haul it off. The stench sanctified suffering, they called it. In theory, these hospitals were places of mercy. In practice, They were places where people came to wait sometimes days, sometimes weeks, rarely longer for either a miracle or a funeral. There were no surgeries, no diagnostics, no second opinions. Most patients were simply made comfortable enough to face death with a slightly cleaner tunic and someone whispering Latin in their ear. Imagine a hospice, but with less compassion and more lice. And speaking of compassion, nurses as we understand them today did not exist. You had caretakers, sure, but they were often volunteers, clergy, or desperate souls working for redemption points in heaven. They meant well, but they were overworked, undertrained, and constantly exposed to every disease known to medieval man. Some grew numb, some grew pious, some simply stopped showing up. The turnover rate was high, especially after outbreaks, or plagues, or Mondays. Let's not forget the patients themselves. You weren't surrounded by calm, grateful souls sipping herbal tea. You were surrounded by moaning, sweating, often delirious strangers. Some prayed, some cried, some screamed non-stop about visions of St. Sebastian in their oatmeal. Mental illness was undiagnosed, untreated, and thrown in the same bed as dysentery and infected wounds. And if you were lucid, you got to watch this circus from 2 feet away. Hope you enjoyed the show. No refunds, no anesthesia. And yet people kept going, because what else could they do? The alternative was dying alone in a ditch, which, to be fair, was probably cleaner. Hospitals were terrifying. Yes, but they offered shelter food and a faint illusion of care. You could be near others. You could hope, however irrationally, that someone might help, or at least bury you properly. Now were all hospitals like this? Not quite. A few larger institutions, often in cities or under royal patronage, had slightly better conditions. They had more staff, few learned monks, and occasionally a library full of outdated Greek theories. But even those places were more about comfort than cure. Medicine wasn't expected to work, it was expected to look holy. And if someone did recover, it was chalked up to divine intervention, not the rat-infested bedding or mouldy barley water on bright spot records. Monks were meticulous about writing things down. They documented symptoms, deaths, recoveries, rare and even strange dreams. These records, while grim, have given historians an invaluable window into just how many people died horribly, and how poorly anyone understood why. It's dark, yes, but it's history. And history, like medieval hospitals, often smells faintly of boiled cabbage and regret. And then there were the miracle wards. Yes, some hospitals had chapels or side rooms reserved for those hoping for divine healing. Pilgrims would lie there clutching relics and murmuring prayers to saints famous for curing boils or blindness. Some were even convinced they'd been healed, usually after days of fasting, hallucination and mild dehydration. Whether it was divine grace or just the fever breaking, no one questioned it. The miracle had happened. Praise be. Now let's clean up the vomit. And the dead, always more of them. Burial was often nearby. Some hospitals had their own cemeteries full of unmarked graves. If you were lucky, someone lit a candle and muttered a verse. If not, you were rolled in a shroud and tucked into the ground before the next patient arrived. The cycle never stopped. Sick in, dead out. Day after day, prayer after prayer, body after body. So next time you lie in a clean hospital bed with beeping machines and nurses who know your name, think of your medieval counterpart. Think of them lying in a shared pile of damp hay, listening to a dying monk whisper about salvation while rats sniff their bandages. Think of them waiting for comfort and getting soup. Think of the courage it took just to show up. And maybe don't complain about the hospital cafeteria, because at least your food doesn't come with fleas. If you were sick in the Middle Ages, odds were high you'd stay that way, and odds were even higher you'd pass it on to everyone within sneezing distance. But did anyone understand what was happening? Absolutely not. The word contagion didn't exist in their minds. Not really. The concept of one person makes another person sick was about as foreign as a toothbrush. If you coughed near someone and they died a week later, the assumption wasn't that you infected them, it was that you both had bad moral character or worse, shared sin proximity. The dominant theory at the time was miasma, translation bad air, filthy smells from swamps, trashed dead bodies, or that one guy in your village who refused to wash his underarms were blamed for spreading disease. If the air stank, it was dangerous. Therefore, the solution was to make the air smell better. Hence the rise of pomanders, little scented balls people wore on chains and stuffing bird beaks, full of herbs. Hello again, plague doctor. It was aromatherapy, but with more screaming and death. There were zero precautions round the sick. No masks, no hand washing, no distancing. In fact, getting close to the ill was often seen as an act of virtue. Touching a leper showed you were holy. Kissing a plague victim's forehead might earn you bonus salvation points. Mothers continued nursing their plague-stricken children. Priests gave last rites with their bare hands. Compassion, yes, but also a free ticket to join the deceased by next Tuesday. Let's be clear, medieval people weren't dumb. They saw patterns. They noticed that when one person got sick, others often followed. But without germ theory or microscopes, they reached different conclusions. Maybe it was the will of God. Maybe the stars aligned in a particularly vengeful way. Maybe someone nearby had angered a saint and now the whole village was being punished like naughty school children. Logic was optional. Panic was standard. Some people believed that diseases were carried by sound. Yes, sound. The ringing of bells, the weeping of widows, the moaning of the sick. These weren't just tragic noises, they were suspected of carrying illness through the air, like demonic podcasts. That's why during plagues, cities silenced their bells, banned singing, and discouraged loud crying. If you dared scream too loud during a funeral, you might accidentally trigger another one. Others blamed clothing. Not that it was dirty, though, let's face it, it was, but that it absorbed disease. A robe worn by a sick man was considered cursed. Some believe the illness clung to the cloth like a vengeful ghost, just waiting for a new host. People burned clothing in massive bonfires, threw shoes into rivers, or buried entire wardrobes with the dead. The idea that microscopic life might be involved, not even close. But spooky fashion, that was a solid theory. The wealthy tried to escape contagion by running. Literally. They packed up their carriages, grabbed their favourite relics, and fled to the countryside. This, of course, only helped spread the disease faster. Rich people unknowingly carried sickness from cities to farms, from one region to the next, like aristocratic disease delivery services. Ironically, the more they fled, the more they doomed everyone else. But hey, at least they had monogrammed handkerchiefs to cough into. Quarantine, when it finally happened, was more of an improvisation than a science. Some port cities like Venice started the 40 days idea ships from infected areas were forced to wait offshore for 40 days before disembarking. That was pretty smart for the time. But on land, quarantine meant locking entire families inside their homes, boarding up the windows and letting nature take its course. If you lived, congrats. If not, someone would eventually sweep up your bones. Markets and fairs didn't stop. Weddings continued. Festivals still boomed with music, dancing, and generous helpings of contaminated stew. During major outbreaks, people threw plague parties, yes, actual plague parties, to get it over with. This wasn't bravery. It was despair dressed in a tunic. People figured they'd all die anyway, so why not go out drunk, sweaty, and covered in questionable meat pies? One popular medieval belief was that God sent disease to punish sin. Therefore, if your town got sick, it wasn't a medical problem, it was a moral one. Cue the mass processions of flagellants men who marched through towns, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. They walked barefoot, chanted dirges, and painted the streets with their own blood. And yes, they were often contagious. They brought penitence and pustules in equal measure. Jews, lepers, foreigners, and widows were frequently blamed for causing outbreaks. The logic went something like, we're all sick. Let's kill the nearest vulnerable group and hope God notices. Entire communities were wiped out based on suspicion alone. Wells were poisoned allegedly. Crops were cursed allegedly. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Fear did. And fear is highly contagious even when you don't understand how germs work. Even the concept of isolation was twisted by misunderstanding. In some places, leper colonies were established not to treat the sick, but to remove them from polite society. If you showed signs of disease, you were declared legally dead. Your possessions were seized. You were forced to wear special clothes, carry a bell, and shout unclean as you walked. It wasn't protection, it was persecution. And yet people thought this was healthcare. By the 14th century, after the Black Death had ravaged half the continent, some faint awareness began to creep in. People noticed that grave diggers and butchers were dying faster than bakers and shepherds. Midwives and caretakers fell sick in droves. But without microscopes, without science, these observations stayed trapped in the realm of rumour and fear. Disease wasn't spread by droplets. It was spread by judgment, suspicion, and that one guy who wouldn't stop coughing in church. You want a picture of medieval contagion control. Imagine a burning house, and instead of grabbing water, everyone just debates whose sin caused the fire, while fanning the flames with their hats. No masks, no medicine, no mercy, just prayers, funerals, and another round of blaming the cat. And through it all, people kept surviving. Not because of strategy, but despite it. The human body is stubborn. Communities rebuilt. Families mourned and moved on. And slowly the seeds of real understanding took root, pushed along by observation, desperation, and the haunting memory of towns that disappeared overnight. So next time you complain about wearing a mask on a plane or washing your hands, too often remember your medieval ancestors. They didn't know how disease worked. They thought bad smells and dirty thoughts were the problem. They died clutching garlic-waving incense and blaming Saturn. You have vaccines, Pural, and indoor plumbing. And the word contagion, which, let's be honest, is kind of sexy in a sci-fi horror way. They didn't know what hit them. You do. Act accordingly. Let's take a break from the pus-soaked horror of medieval hospitals to discuss something even more misunderstood: women's health in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. In fact, if you were a woman and your uterus so much as sneezed funny, you were one menstrual cycle away from being labelled a witch, a temptress, or just too emotional to be taken seriously. Pain wasn't something to be treated, it was something to be suspicious of. Because if there was one thing medieval society feared more than disease, it was a woman with an opinion and an irregular period. Women's bodies were seen as mystical, which is medieval for confusing and probably evil. The uterus was considered a wandering organ, yes, wandering. They thought it could move around the body like a lost goat, strangling other organs and causing things like hysteria, fainting, and excessive thought. If a woman laughed too hard, had mood swings, or got headaches, people assumed her uterus had packed its bags and gone exploring. The treatment perfume baths, smelly herbs, and occasionally shouting at her stomach. Menstruation, meanwhile, was treated like biohazardous sorcery. Men feared it. Women feared talking about it. Some believed menstrual blood could rust mirrors, kill crops, or cause dogs to go mad. There were actual texts that warned against letting menstruating women touch meat or wine lest they spoil it was their dark internal moon magic. Cramps, not a medical issue, just punishment for being born female, pain relief, maybe chew on some dried nettles and repent. Pregnancy was no picnic either. There were no prenatal vitamins, no ultrasounds, no understanding of how anything actually worked. Most advice came from midwives, many of whom were wise, experienced, and under constant threat of being burned at the stake. A difficult pregnancy wasn't seen as a complication. It was often interpreted as divine punishment, proof of sin, or again, possible witchcraft. If the baby died, that was on the mother. If the mother died, also on the mother. If both survived, miracle. And then there was childbirth, also known as the most dangerous thing a medieval woman could do, other than have an opinion in public. It was often done at home on a straw bed surrounded by a few women, some half-muttered prayers and an overwhelming sense of doom. There was no understanding of infection, no sterile tools, and no doctor, unless your husband was rich enough to bribe one. Complications. Common. Bleeding to death. Frequent. Baby not breathing. Blame the stars, the devil, or that weird cheese you ate last week. If a woman developed postpartum depression, or as they saw it, strange behaviour after childbirth, she might be labelled unstable, or cursed, or worse, in league with dark forces. Because clearly a mother who cried too much or struggled to bond with her baby wasn't suffering from hormonal chaos. No, she was probably hexed. Enter the priest with holy water and zero understanding. Exit any chance of empathy. Infertility, meanwhile, was always the woman's fault. The man could be 93 years old, covered in boils and coughing up pieces of his soul, but if the couple wasn't producing children, the blame landed squarely on her womb. Some remedies included drinking animal urine, sleeping with sacred relics, or performing midnight dances under a full moon while reciting Latin backwards. If that didn't work, time to see if the neighbour girl was more fertile. Goodbye respect. Hello, replacement wife. Let's talk about sexuality briefly, because in the Middle Ages that conversation wasn't happening either. Female pleasure wasn't considered necessary, desirable, or even real. The female body was a vessel useful for carrying babies and storing guilt. If a woman expressed desire, she was labelled unnatural. If she enjoyed sex, definitely a witch. If she didn't enjoy it, still suspicious. Basically, there was no winning, just bleeding and silence. The church, of course, had its hands in all of this. Women were considered spiritually inferior, morally weaker, and biologically chaotic. The Virgin Mary was the ideal, silent, obedient, and miraculously reproductive. Everyone else problematic. Nuns who got sick were said to be battling inner demons. Midwives who saved lives were accused of heresy. Widows with property were almost always accused of witchcraft. Because a woman with land and opinions, that's basically Satan with better hair. And let's not forget the actual witch hunts. Many women who were burned, drowned, or tortured were simply misunderstood healers. They knew herbs. They delivered babies. They offered comfort. But if they helped one too many people recover, the town started whispering. Because clearly if a woman succeeded at medicine, she was stealing that knowledge from the devil, not learning, not experimenting, not being intelligent, just devilry. Even when medical texts acknowledged women, the tone was insulting at best. They were described as imperfect men physically and morally. Their bodies were seen as wild, unstable, and dangerously moist. Yes, moist was a medical insult. Their blood was hot, then cold, then too cold. Their brains were smaller, their emotions larger, and their value entirely based on reproductive function. It's amazing anyone survived womanhood at all. Of course some women push back. They wrote books, built underground medical networks, and became essential parts of their communities, but their work was constantly threatened. If too many people listened to them, they became targets. You could be the village's only midwife for 20 years, but if one baby died or one jealous husband whispered the wrong thing, you could end up tied to a stake while the town roasted chestnuts nearby. And what about older women? Menopause wasn't understood, and women who stopped bleeding were seen as suspicious. If you were over 40 unmarried and not dead yet, you were either a holy widow or a walking red flag. People whispered. Children stared. Someone's cow got sick, and suddenly you were the cause. Never mind that you'd spent your life feeding people, healing people, and keeping them from dying in childbirth. Gratitude was not a medieval specialty. Still, women helped each other. They formed networks of care, unofficial, unrecognized, and often dangerous. They passed knowledge in whispers, in recipes, in gestures. They made healing brews, delivered babies in candlelight, and sat beside each other when no one else would. Their legacy was oral, hidden, and essential. They kept entire communities alive while being treated as disposable. So the next time you get your annual gynecological checkup conducted by a trained professional with sterile tools and a degree, remember your medieval sisters, the ones who had to hide their strength, who were burned for being too helpful, who were blamed for every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every ache and groan in their bodies. Remember that their pain was silenced, their knowledge stolen, their health ignored, and thank whatever gods or germs you believe in that you live in a time where a cramp doesn't earn you a funeral or a fire pit. Let's dive into a topic you didn't ask for but absolutely deserve medieval medicine and poop. Yes, poop, feces, dung, excrement. Call it what you want, but in the Middle Ages it wasn't just something you tried to avoid stepping in. It was something that might end up on your body, in your mouth, or applied lovingly to an open wound. And no, I'm not joking. If you think modern medicine sometimes sounds weird, just wait until you hear about the time someone's diarrhea was considered a gift from the gods. First, understand the mindset in medieval Europe. If it came out of the body, it must be important. Blood was sacred, urine was a diagnostic tool, and poop was versatile. It could be medicine, it could be magic, it could even be a sign of divine punishment if it smelled especially bad or landed in the wrong place. Physicians weren't just interested in what you said during a consultation. They wanted to know what came out of every hole you had, especially the southern one. Doctors often examined feces with the same care a modern sommelier examines wine. Colour, texture, smell, even the sound it made hitting the chamber pot was all taken into account. One text described ideal healthy stool as well-shaped and not too dry, and no, that wasn't advice from a wellness blogger, that was a legitimate medieval medical observation. A loose and stinking stool meant your humours were misaligned. A greenish one, you might be cursed. A pale, dry turd, time to prepare your will. But poop wasn't just a diagnostic tool, it was an ingredient. That's right. Human feces, dog feces, cow dung, pigeon droppings, you name it, someone somewhere mashed it into a paste and called it medicine. Got a skin infection? Try a poultice made of goose dung and rose oil. Aching joints, smear warm cow feces over your knees and wait for the healing magic. Sore throat, gargle with something that once exited the rear end of a barn animal. Taste aside, the stench alone was probably enough to scare the bacteria into fleeing. One particularly charming remedy for wounds involved mixing human feces with wine and applying it directly to the cut. The theory: the feces drew out the bad humours and allowed healing to begin. The reality: infection. Lots of it. You didn't just smell like disease, you became it. But if the wound closed eventually, they called it a success. Never mind the gangrene crawling up your arm or the village dog refusing to go near you. Let's not forget the widespread use of animal dung in eye treatments. Yes, eye treatments. There's nothing quite like smearing goose droppings into your infected eyeball while praying to St. Lucy. Some recipes even insisted the dung had to be fresh because apparently aged poop lost its healing essence. If you're wincing right now, imagine how the patients felt. Or don't. Your brain deserves better. Some healers took it even further. They believed poop could predict the future. A particularly dramatic bowel movement might signal an upcoming illness, a shift in the stars, or a family member's death. If you thought your horoscope was vague, try interpreting a peasant's diarrhea in candlelight. Watery brown and bubbling. Ah, yes, Mercury is definitely in retrograde and your uncle's about to fall off a ladder. Why was poop so popular in medicine? Blame the humoral theory. Remember the 4 magical body fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Well, excrement was seen as the body's final verdict on your internal balance. If your humours were off, your stool would reflect it. And if the stool could re-enter your body in the right form, it might just put things back in order. Logic. None. Confidence off the charts. Now let's talk about enemas. They weren't invented in the Middle Ages, but boy did medieval Europe embrace them. There were enemas for cleansing enemas, for healing enemas, for clearing out demons. Some used warm water, others used wine, some even included, you guessed it, poop. Injecting fermented feces into the rectum was seen as a way to rebalance the body's inner workings. You haven't lived until a monk shoves a goose feather enema tube into your backside and tells you it's for your spleen. In royal courts, enemas were a luxury service. Kings had royal enemas performed by court physicians. Fancy nozzles, heated rooms, silk sheets. It was the medieval version of a spa day, except instead of cucumber water and essential oils, you got herbal sludge shot into your colon, while a man in a robe whispered about the stars. And yes, there were records. Because medieval nobles loved documenting their bowel routines. Some even bragged about how often they evacuated. But before you laugh too hard, modern medicine has looped back to poop in some surprising ways. Fecal transplants are now a real thing used to treat conditions like C. Difficile infections. Scientists have found that gut bacteria from a healthy donor can help reset the intestinal system of a sick person. So in a weird, deeply disturbing way, medieval healers were onto something. They just didn't have microscopes, hygiene, or any idea what they were doing. Details, details. Of course not all poop was seen as equal. Dog poop was often considered the most potent, especially when white and dried. It was ground into powders, mixed into ointments, or blown into wounds using tiny pipes. Pause to scream here. Human feces had the advantage of familiarity. After all, you could harvest it from yourself. And pigeon droppings were thought to have cooling properties, which is ironic, considering the burning sensation most patients likely felt after application. Poop was even used in dentistry. Toothache try smearing a paste of burnt mouse bones and dung across your gums. Bad breath gargle with a mixture of vinegar and droppings. Did it help? Not in the slightest. But your breath was so foul afterward that no one came close enough to complain. Problem solved. Let's not forget the storage and transportation of poop-based remedies. Apothecaries kept jars of dried feces on their shelves labelled carefully next to herbs, powders and crushed gems. They sold it like tea leaves. They wrapped it in parchment. They shipped it across kingdoms. Somewhere out there a medieval courier died tragically while carrying a satchel full of royal poop salve. May his sacrifice never be forgotten. And yes, there were skeptics. Some physicians, particularly in the later Middle Ages, began to question whether rubbing waste into wounds was truly the best course of action. Others doubled down, insisting that the strength of a remedy was directly tied to how awful it smelled. A cure that didn't burn your nostrils or offend every passing goat was clearly too weak. This was medicine through suffering. The grosser it was, the more likely it had to be working. So next time you grimace at modern pills, essential oils, or those weird detox teas, remember this. At least you're not smearing excrement on your eczema. At least your doctor isn't describing your stool in poetic Latin while boiling sheep dung in the background. At least your pharmacist doesn't hand you a jar labelled dry cow blessing topical use only. You live in a world where poop is mostly flushed and rarely weaponized. You are lucky, you are modern, you are clean. And your ancestors, they were brave and deeply tragically unsanitized. Let's say your fever hasn't broken. Your wound smells like spoiled stew and your eye twitches every time someone says humorous. You've tried the urine tasting the soup for everything method, the poop poultices, and yes, even the herbal goose fat suppository. Nothing's worked. So what's left in the Middle Ages? The answer was simple, consistent, and utterly useless prayer. Lots of it. If you weren't getting better, the cure clearly wasn't earthly, it was heavenly. And if God didn't fix you time to slap on some leeches and hope for divine inspiration via blood loss, prayer wasn't just a part of the healing process, it was the healing process. Hospitals were run by monks' clinics doubled as chapels, and every illness came with its own recommended saint. Toothache, pray to Saint Apollonia. Eye problems, that's St. Lucy's department. Boils and plagues. St. Sebastian, please report to the front desk. Illness was seen as a spiritual test, a moral punishment, or a random act of divine disapproval. Getting better meant you were pure. Staying sick meant your soul was crustier than your infected toe. Doctors and priests worked hand in robe. A physician might bleed you on Monday, and a friar might exorcise your spleen on Tuesday. There was no separation between medicine and faith. Both were wielded like equally confused swords. When a patient died, it wasn't because the treatments failed. It was because God had a different plan. A plan that apparently involved letting your lungs rot from the inside out while chanting Ave Maria between coughs. Relics with a medieval version of prescription pads. Need healing, touch a bone fragment from a long-dead saint. Maybe kiss a vial of dried blood that may or may not be beet juice. Some churches proudly displayed whole saintly limbs encased in gold and optimism. Pilgrims would travel for weeks just to touch the hem of a relic's box, believing a splinter from the true cross could cure gout faster than any barber with a blade. The more absurd the relic, the more potent it supposedly was. This toenail cured my epilepsy, probably someone somewhere. People wore amulets, chanted prayers, slept on holy ground, and bathed in sacred springs. Every ailment had a ritual. For epilepsy, one might crawl under a church altar during Mass. For skin conditions, perhaps a circle of monks would sing psalms while rubbing you with holy oil or bacon fat depending on availability. For possession, good old-fashioned screaming and cold water, maybe a cross to the face. And if that didn't work well, you were either incurable or really good at pretending. Then there were processions. When a city was struck with plague, the logical response was to gather everyone into a tight, coughing crowd and march through the streets praying, carrying statues, swinging incense, singing hymns. Because nothing says contagion control like densely packed humans chanting in unison and wiping their tears on shared handkerchiefs. Shockingly, this often made things worse, but at least they looked holy while spreading the death. And if prayer didn't work fast enough, time for leeches. Again, always the leeches. These slimy little bloodsuckers were medical rock stars. Applied to everything from migraines to hemorrhoids, they were believed to draw out excess blood, and with it the disease. Some texts recommended specific placement temple for headaches, lower spine for fevers, and other areas for intimate imbalances. You haven't lived until a monk calmly suggests applying a leech to your groin in the name of St. Jude. Leeches weren't picky. They were stored in muddy jars, starved for days, and slapped onto skin with the enthusiasm of man late for vespers. If one didn't stick, no problem, just grab another. If they gorged themselves and fell off, excellent. The patient would often faint from blood loss, which was considered a promising sign. He's pale and unconscious. Finally, the humours are balancing. Leech therapy was such a trend that apothecaries ran out. There were leech shortages, leech smugglers, leech thefts. People stole them from ponds, bought them from street vendors, and carried them in little pouches like grotesque pets. Some towns even hired leech keepers whose job was to maintain a steady supply for the local hospitals. And yet nobody asked the obvious question, why are we relying on glorified waterworms to cure smallpox? The church had explanations for all of this. Illness came from sin. Suffering built character. Pain was a holy refinement process like spiritual exfoliation. And if someone healed, it wasn't because of the mouldy bread they ate or the leech to the elbow, it was because the right prayer was said at the right time. This logic led to healing lotteries where people lined up at shrines waiting for their turn to be chosen by divine mercy. Some left dancing, some left dead, all left broke. And if you couldn't afford relics or shrines, you could always confess harder. Some friars recommended listing your sins in order of stench, as if moral decay gave off a specific smell. Others prescribed pilgrimages, long expensive walks to holy sites with open sores and no shoes. If your foot fell off halfway through, that was considered part of the cleansing process. Also a sign that you needed more leeches. The blending of faith and medicine created some strange hybrids. Monks who dabbled in alchemy, nuns who made ointments while chanting psalms, physicians who carried prayer books next to their scalpels. There were entire treatises written about the moral causes of indigestion. Did you eat too much cheese, or did you covet your neighbour's goat again? Either way, say 10 Hail Marys and avoid lentils for a week. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Some people faked sickness to gain sympathy. Others faked healing to boost the reputation of a local saint. There were even staged miracles complete with props, witnesses, and dramatic lighting reed torches. But in an age without real medicine, even a fake miracle was better than no hope at all. And people wanted to believe, needed to believe, because the alternative was unbearable. Prayer wasn't just treatment, it was the glue holding society together. When your neighbour's son died of a rash and your daughter was coughing blood, you turned to the only thing that didn't run out or rot. Faith, whether it worked or not, whether it made sense or not, whether it ended in healing or just a slightly more peaceful death. You whispered the words, lit the candle, placed the relic by the bed and hoped the sky was listening. And sometimes, against all odds, people got better. Was it the leech, the soup, the whispered Latin, the passage of time? No one knew, but the monk would smile, the townspeople would cheer, and the patient would limp out of the hospital wrapped in bandages and belief. Another miracle, another notch in heaven's belt. So next time your doctor prescribes antibiotics and not 3 prayers and a blessed slug, thank modern medicine. And next time someone says, just have faith, remember your ancestors had only that, and a leech named Greg clinging to their thigh. Let's take a brief moment to imagine you're a medieval peasant. You've been hearing voices you cry for no reason, or maybe you're just sad all the time. In modern times, someone would suggest therapy, a warm cup of tea and a highly trained professional with glasses and kind eyebrows. But in the Middle Ages, you know what they thought, demons. Definitely demons. No second opinion needed. If you were mentally unwell, congratulations, you were either possessed, cursed, or on the fast track to becoming a public spectacle. Mental health in the Middle Ages wasn't even a concept. There was no vocabulary for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or trauma. You were either normal or you were touched by evil spirits, divine punishment, or maybe the moon. Yes, the moon. Lunar influence was blamed for everything from nosebleeds to madness, hence the word lunatic, which literally means moonstruck. So if you had a panic attack under a full moon, don't worry. It wasn't your brain, it was cosmic punishment for existing. And treatment. Forget gentle therapy or soft-lit counselling rooms. You are more likely to be locked in a monastery chained to a wall or paraded through the village so everyone could see what sin looked like in physical form. Some were forced to fast until they collapsed. Others were beaten to release the devil. If you were lucky, a monk might sprinkle you with holy water and read scriptures at you until you passed out. If you were unlucky, someone might try to drill a hole in your skull to let the bad spirits escape. That was called trepanning. And yes, they did it without anesthesia. There were no asylums at first, only prison cells or remote caves. Later specialised institutions emerged, but calling them hospitals is generous. Take Bedlam in London short for Bethlehem Royal Hospital, one of the earliest mental institutions and also one of the worst. Patients were chained to walls, screamed in darkness, and were occasionally beaten for entertainment. Yes, you read that right. Public viewings of mentally ill patients became a thing. Families paid to gawk at the suffering. A twisted version of dinner theatre, but with more sobbing and less bread. Women had it worse, much worse. Any sign of mental distress, mood swings, postpartum depression, even just being outspoken could brand you as a heretic or a witch. You didn't need to be violent or unstable, just inconvenient. A woman with uncontrolled emotions was seen as suspicious. A woman who cried too often, dangerous. A woman who didn't cry at all, also dangerous. Basically, the only safe option was being silent and invisible, which ironically also made people nervous. Religious explanations ruled the day. The church viewed mental illness as either a test of faith or the result of sin. Possession by the devil was the go-to explanation for anything they didn't understand, which in this case was literally everything involving the human mind. Symptoms like hallucinations, paranoia, or repetitive behaviours were met not with compassion but with exorcism. Priests recited Latin over the afflicted while the person convulsed, screamed, or sat silently wondering why everyone was shouting. Demonic possession wasn't a metaphor. It was considered literal. People believed that actual demons had taken up residence inside the body and were puppeteering the person from the inside out. That twitch demon, that mumbling demon choir practice, that catatonic stare into the distance, demons playing chess in your frontal lobe. The cure was not therapy. It was ritual violence. And if that failed, burial usually followed. Some treatments veered into accidental torture. Cold water immersion was popular. If you were hysterical, they'd dunk you in freezing rivers to shock the madness out. If you didn't drown great, you were probably cured. If you did drown well, then clearly the demons had won. Win-win logic at its finest. Bloodletting was also common. Because if you're sad, clearly you have too much blood. Better get rid of some, maybe through your ankle, with a knife. Of course, not everyone got the demon treatment. The wealthy, as usual, were handled more delicately. A nobleman who began acting erratically might be labelled eccentric, melancholic, or suffering from noble humours. He'd be sent to a countryside retreat, given calming herbs, and allowed to scream at birds in peace. Meanwhile, a peasant with the same symptoms would be accused of goat theft heresy, or being touched by the devil's wind and promptly locked in a shed. There were natural explanations starting to creep in. Some medieval thinkers, particularly in the Islamic world and later in Europe, began to suspect the brain might be involved. They suggested mental illness could stem from imbalances in the humours or physical injury. But this knowledge moved slowly buried under centuries of religious fear and folk superstition. And even when someone suggested a non-demonic cause, the church gave them that look. You know the one. The enjoy being excommunicated look. The stigma was brutal. Families often hid mentally ill relatives, locked them away, or disowned them entirely. Having someone mad in the household was shameful. It wasn't considered illness. It was considered evidence that your bloodline had sinned, your ancestors were cursed, or that your wife definitely slept with a demon. Society treated mental illness as both a moral failing and a spiritual infection. If you didn't fix it, it meant you wanted to be broken. And let's talk about madness in warfare. Soldiers who returned from battle trembling, jumpy, or unable to sleep weren't seen as traumatized. They were seen as cowards, or worse, touched by evil. No one had the vocabulary for PTSD. No one cared about the psychological toll of hacking people with swords for days on end. You either came back normal or you didn't come back at all. And if you did return but kept screaming in your sleep, the town priest would come check for demons. Again. Even laughter could be suspicious. Too much mirth. Probably hiding something. Too little. Possibly cursed. You were expected to be just the right level of miserable, not too loud, not too quiet, and definitely not talking to yourself in the market while petting invisible squirrels. The social line between harmless oddball and possessed threat was razor thin and usually decided by whoever was in a bad mood that day. There were, believe it or not, small pockets of care. Some monasteries took in mentally ill people and offered gentle routines, prayer and food. Some communities had fools who were tolerated or even celebrated as eccentrics. And in some rare cases, people with mental illness were seen as spiritually gifted, able to glimpse truths beyond the veil. But these were exceptions. Most stories ended in isolation pain or execution by confused neighbours. Still, people survived. They endured. They whispered their fears in candlelight, prayed into the void, and waited for the screams to stop. Some found solace in music or animals, or in staring at the stars and pretending they were somewhere else. Because even in the darkest corners of a medieval dungeon or a monastery cellar lined with rats, hope clung on like mould on stone. So today, when you're able to say I'm feeling anxious without being slapped with holy water, take a moment to honour how far we've come. When you take medication, see a therapist, or simply cry in public without being chained to a wall, realize that this is progress. You're not possessed. You're not cursed. You're not sinful. You're human. Your ancestors didn't get that luxury. You do. Don't waste it. Let's talk hydration, because even in the darkest, filthiest corners of medieval life, people still needed to drink something. And here's the cruel cosmic joke: the most obvious liquid water was also the most likely to end you. That stream behind your village full of feces, that well in the town square bubbling with disease, that bucket of rainwater, enjoy your dysentery cocktail. In the Middle Ages, water wasn't life. It was Russian roulette with a wooden ladle. The problem was simple. People didn't understand germs. They knew water could make you sick, but not why. So they tried filtering it through cloth, boiling it sometimes, or just pretending it was fine if it looked clear enough. Spoiler, it wasn't. That fresh water often contained the runoff from your neighbour's latrine, the local butcher's blood slick, and the decomposing dreams of small animals. But hey, what's a little cholera between friends? Urban water sources were especially horrific. Medieval cities had no plumbing, no sewers, and no sense of maybe we shouldn't dump our guts where we drink. Waste flowed down the streets in charming little rivers of rot. Rain simply helped distribute the flavour. Wells became disease pits, but people kept using them because what else were they supposed to do? Ask God for a spring to appear in their backyard. Water was survival, even if it sometimes came with the side of stomach cramps and existential despair. Bathing in it rare, drinking it risky, washing your food with it extremely questionable. That's why most people turn to the Middle Ages' favourite alternative ale. Not beer, not wine, small ale. It was weak, watered-down alcohol with just enough fermentation to kill off some but not all of the invisible death floating in your cup. It didn't taste great, it didn't hydrate much, but it also didn't liquefy your intestines, most of the time. Ale was the beverage of choice for everyone, from children to monks to peasants with 5 teeth and a dream. People drank it with breakfast, lunch and dinner. Infants were sometimes given ale-soaked bread. Monks brewed it in massive barrels. Women made it at home in cauldrons, stirring the bubbling mess and praying it didn't turn into vinegar. It was the Gatorade of the Middle Ages, technically hydrating, vaguely energizing, and probably full of things you didn't want to ask questions about. Now let's not confuse small ale with the party starter beers of today. This was low alcohol, usually between 1% to 2% ABV, just enough to keep microbes at bay, but not enough to turn you into the village jester. That came later when you graduated to strong ale, which was reserved for festivals' holy days, and that one uncle who drank before breakfast and wrestled pigs recreationally. Strong ale could hit you like a horse cart, and without modern hangover remedies, the day after usually included praying, vomiting, and wondering if you accidentally died. But even ale had risks. If it wasn't brewed properly, it could go sour, mouldy, or full-on poisonous. The ingredients weren't always standardized. Some recipes included herbs that were basically medieval roofies. Others used weird grains that triggered ergot, poisoning a lovely little fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and death. People would dance uncontrollably in the street, claw at the air, or think they were made of glass. And this was before brunch. Desperate for variety, some turned to cider or mead. Cider was safer than water, tastier than small ale, and mostly available where apples grew in abundance. Mead was fermented, honey water delicious but expensive. So unless you were a monk, a noble or a bard trying to get laid, mead wasn't a daily drink. For the average person, it was back to ale soup broth or whatever dripped from the sky and didn't immediately smell like corpse. And yes, rainwater was a thing, collected in barrels used for cooking, washing, and sometimes drinking if filtered through cloth and blind optimism. But rain could also collect bird droppings, roof soot, and the occasional decomposing rodent. Still, it was free. And in a time when water cost your life and ale cost your coin, sometimes you just closed your eyes and swallowed. Milk. Forget it. Milk spoiled fast, and refrigeration was a pipe dream literally since there were no pipes. You could drink it fresh if you had a cow goat or wet nurse nearby, but within hours it turned into a chunky soup of regret. Most milk was turned into cheese or butter, which at least had the decency to mould slowly. And even then it wasn't safe. Parasites loved milk like rats loved grain. What about juice cute idea? But the lack of sanitation and high fermentation rates meant that most fruit juice turned into wine before it reached your cup. Grape juice. More like accidental communion. Apple juice. One wrong apple, and suddenly you were reenacting the Book of Job in your outhouse. Most people didn't even try. Fruit was eaten raw, if at all. Liquid fruit was for rich people with glassware and gallstones. So yes, hydration was an act of faith. You drank what you could find. You hoped the ale was fresh, the water was passable, and the weird smell coming from the barrel didn't mean you were about to see your ancestors. And when people died of stomach ailments, nobody batted an eye. They just blamed bad air sin or the alignment of Mars and continued sipping the same soup-coloured liquid that killed Jeff last week. Yet somehow people survived. Kids grew up. Elders sat by fires drinking weak ale and telling stories of the Great Stomach Purge of 1349. Humanity adapted. Livers toughened. Tongues stopped tasting. And entire generations grew up thinking that diarrhea was just a part of breakfast. So next time you fill your glass with clear cold-filtered water free of parasites, poisons and plague, take a moment. Reflect. Say a little prayer for the peasants who never knew what hydration without fear tasted like. They drank to survive, you drink to thrive. And most importantly, you don't need a leech to fix your hangover. Imagine waking up in your medieval home, a cosy little timber shack with a thatched roof and questionable airflow. You stretch, yawn, and then grab the chamber pot sitting under your bed, 'cause guess what? There's no bathroom, no plumbing, no toilet. And when it's full of last night's dinner in its glorious recycled form, what do? Simple, you open your window and toss it directly into the street below. Congratulations, you've just participated in medieval waste management. Public sanitation in the Middle Ages was less of a system and more of a collective shrug. Cities and towns had no sewers, no garbage collection, and no real strategy for handling the stuff that came out of people. Human waste, throw it out. Animal waste, leave it there. Rotten food, dead rats, mysterious puddles. Walk around them if you can, slip and curse if you can't. Streets were not so much paved as marinated in a perpetual broth of filth. If you lived in a city, you learned to walk carefully. Not just because of mud or stones, but because every single building emptied its bowels out the window. People shouted a warning gardeloo in some places, or just hoped whoever was below had quick reflexes. Clothes got ruined. Hats got ruined. Reputations got ruined. And if you were unlucky enough to trip and fall well, that's one way to get baptized into the realities of urban life. The stench was apocalyptic. Every alley reeked of urine, excrement, rotting meat and failure. The air was thick with it. You didn't just smell the street, you wore the street. Shoes were constantly being scrubbed with vinegar if you had any, and the smell clung to your clothes like a ghost with digestive problems. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was survival. The rich doused themselves in floral waters. The poor just tried not to breathe too deeply. And yet animals were allowed to roam freely. Pigs wandered through market squares like they paid rent. Horses dumped wherever they felt the urge. Chickens, dogs, goats, all pooping freely, cheerfully and frequently. A single morning stroll could expose you to more biological hazards than a modern wastewater plant. If your boots made a squishing sound, you knew better than to look down. Eye contact with the street was a mistake. Latrines existed, but they were rare, shared and horrifying. Public privies, if available, were often communal benches with multiple holes, no privacy, and one shared wooden stick for wiping. You heard that right. One stick. Called a gomp stick or tosser, it was rinsed between users allegedly. If you were lucky, if not, congratulations on your new infection. Toilet paper. Not invented yet. Moss hay or whatever was nearby was your best friend, or your worst enemy. Even castles had terrible bathrooms. Nobles did their business in guardrobes, essentially stone chutes built into the walls. Waste dropped down into a moat or just onto the earth, where it fermented slowly in the sun like some kind of aristocratic chutney. Moats weren't just defensive structures, they were medieval sewage lagoons. Invading armies didn't need to breach the castle walls, they just needed to smell them. Cleaning the streets was rare, and when it happened it was usually during a plague or when someone of importance visited. Town councils would hire men to shovel the waste into carts and dump it somewhere outside the walls. That somewhere often became the next neighbourhood's problem. Dumps were unregulated. Giant piles of waste fermented in the open, attracting rats, flies, and occasionally children who didn't know better. And then there were the rivers. Ah, yes, the rivers, the natural garbage disposals of the Middle Ages. People dumped everything into them. Human waste, animal carcasses, dye runoff from tanneries, broken furniture, grandma's chamber pot contents. If it could flow, it was thrown. The same river you used to clean your clothes was also where someone upstream had just washed their sheep intestines. Bathing in the river was a full-body gamble. Water carriers, usually poor men or children, collected water from those same rivers and sold it door to door. They had no choice. Wells were scarce and clean water was fantasy. So people cooked cleaned and sometimes even drank that toxic soup. And when they got sick, the doctor would say, "You probably need more soup." Everything came back to soup, which was made with water from the same river. Cesspits were the medieval version of septic tanks, except without the tank part. These were holes in the ground dug near homes to collect waste. No lining, no ventilation, just raw sewage marinating underground until it overflowed or exploded during heavy rain. Maintenance was simple: throw in more straw, toss in some lime if you could afford it, and ignore the smell until someone's floorboard started rotting from below. Sometimes the pits collapsed. Imagine waking up in your bed and suddenly sinking through the floor into a pool of liquefied sin. It happened. Records exist. These were not urban legends. They were urban collapses. Entire outhouses disappeared. Families fled. Priests were called, not to save the house, but to bless the stench away. Good luck with that father. And still no one thought this might be a problem. People believed disease came from bad smells, miasma, not the filth itself. So instead of cleaning the streets, they lit incense or carried around bags of herbs. They made no effort to reduce waste, just to mask its scent. It was a world powered by denial, desperation, and a remarkably high tolerance for stepping in something warm. The rich built their homes above the streets, literally. Upper floors jutted out, providing shade for the filth below, and ensuring their chamber pot deposits hit pedestrians with maximum velocity. It was architecture meets passive aggression. Meanwhile, the poor lived ground-level, breathing in every splatter, every stench, and every curse of medieval sanitation. You couldn't even complain. What would you say? "Please don't dump your bowels on my baby, good luck with that." But surely someone tried to fix this right. Occasionally. Some cities had rules against tossing waste into the street. Fines were issued. Warnings posted. Enforcement was rare. After all, the town constable didn't want to wade through filth to hand out tickets. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, just like the rest of medieval life. And let's not forget the psychological effect. People became used to it, numb, desensitized. When filth is everywhere, it becomes invisible. Children played in it. Lovers strolled through it. Bakers sold bread beside it. And every morning more waste came raining down, like the worst weather forecast imaginable. Chance of urine showers 90%. Localized fecal squalls expected in the market district. So next time you flush a toilet, wash your hands, or walk down a clean sidewalk without gagging, pause. Reflect. Whisper a quiet thank you to indoor plumbing. You don't live in a world where people hurl their filth into public spaces. You don't have to worry about falling into a cesspit. You are safe. And dry. Mostly. So let's say you're sick again. You've bled out half your body's fluids, been leached in places you didn't know existed, and drunk more suspicious soup than any one human should. And yet that fever just won't quit. Time to call the doctor. He shows up in a robe that hasn't seen a wash since the Crusades, gives you a once-over, squints thoughtfully at your belly button and declares, "You need to wear a dead mole around your neck." Ah, yes. Finally, science. The dead mole necklace was not a metaphor. It was an actual treatment. Moles were believed to have special healing properties, especially when strung around the throat like a morbid fashion statement. If you had a sore throat, the logic went the mole's tiny corpse would absorb the illness, or perhaps confuse it, or maybe scare it away. Disease was seen as almost sentient, like a medieval burglar you could trick with accessories. But the mole wasn't alone. Medieval medicine was full of odd prescriptions that made your symptoms seem perfectly reasonable by comparison. Suffering from jaundice, drink the urine of a ginger-haired boy. Yes, specifically a ginger. Got epilepsy. Try swallowing a dried wolf's heart under a full moon. Better yet, wrap it in linen and wear it next to your own heart. Nothing says I'm getting better like the constant aroma of sun-baked predator flesh on your chest. The belief system behind this madness was something called sympathetic magic. The idea that, like cures, if something looked vaguely like your organ, or behaved in a way that mirrored your symptoms, it must help. Got kidney pain? Use kidney beans. Trouble with your liver? Rub on liverwort. Coughing? Wrap a dried frog in silk and keep it in your pocket. Medicine was less about logic and more about visual rhyming. Animal parts were medicine du jour. Mice, toads, foxes, eels, anything that slithered, croaked or squeaked was fair game. Boiled snake skin could treat skin conditions. Dried beaver testicles was said to cure hysteria, and bear fat. Perfect for rubbing into sore joints or just generally asserting dominance over your ailments. Apothecaries became more like magical taxidermists grinding antlers and eyeballs into powders with no actual instruction manual. And yes, moles were a recurring theme. These creatures lived underground so naturally they were believed to have a special connection to healing what's inside the human body. If the mole was blind, that was even better. Blind mole. Wisdom, apparently. Or at least enough spiritual confusion to distract your fever while it tried to figure out what the hell was going on. You didn't just wear the mole, you absorbed its mysterious subterranean mojo. Plants weren't safe from weird associations either. Mandrake roots, for instance, were carved into little human shapes and treated like leafy voodoo dolls. They were said to scream when uprooted, probably from embarrassment. You'd tie a dog to the root back away and let the poor beast do the pulling, while everyone prayed it didn't curse the entire village. Then you'd hang the mandrake in your home to protect against witches' illness and bad vibes. Stones too were part of the cure catalogue. Gemstones weren't just jewellery, they were medicine. Amber for asthma, sapphire for ulcers, hematite to stop bleeding. Some physicians recommended pressing a smooth cold rock against your head during a fever, because if your brain was boiling clearly, what you needed was a medieval forehead ice pack minus the ice, and plus a chance of head lice. If the mole necklace didn't work, your doctor might escalate to fumigation therapy. This involved burning various herbs and sometimes actual animal dung, and having the patient inhale the smoke. It was supposed to chase out the evil spirits, or induce vomiting, or both. And if you passed out from the fumes perfect, it meant it was working. Bonus points if the neighbours complained. Healing, but make it a fire hazard. One popular prescription was a poultice of worms and goose grease. Smeared directly onto the afflicted area, it was meant to draw out swelling. If you were particularly fancy, you could add crushed pearls or powdered unicorn horn, which was usually powdered narwhal tusk, but don't ruin the magic. The idea was to make the body uncomfortable enough that the disease just gave up and left. The patient might die in the process, but that was a separate issue. For stomach pain, one physician recommended tying a dried badger paw around your waist. Others said to place a live chicken on your belly while it pooped, because clearly the foulness inside you needed to commune with the foulness outside you. Some healers claimed a live eel inserted in certain places could help balance the humours. We will not be elaborating on that. You're welcome. And then there was blessed bread. Clergy would bless a loaf, feed it to the sick, and wait for the miracle. It didn't matter what was in the bread, mould, maggots, gravel, it had divine power now. If you choked, it was because the devil was resisting. If you vomited, you were purging sin. And if you survived well, clearly the bread did its job. No refunds either way. Of course. All these cures had one thing in common: they relied heavily on belief. Belief in nature, belief in spirits, belief in the doctor even as he handed you a toad smeared in sheep butter and called it a miracle. Faith was the active ingredient in most medieval medicine, that and blind unrelenting hope. But don't laugh too hard. Many of these weird concoctions accidentally helped. Some herbs had real medicinal properties, some smelly salves kept flies off wounds, and some animal-based poultices may have worked despite their ingredients not because of them. Penicillin was discovered by accident after all. So who's to say a mole necklace wasn't the 14th century version of an immune booster? Disgusting, yes. Ineffective. Usually. But always worth a try when death's at your door. So next time you complain about taking a chalky antibiotic pill or rolling your eyes at your grandma's herbal tea obsession, remember at least you're not being told to hang a decaying rodent from your neck like a plague-era fashion statement. At least your doctor has a degree, and at least your medicine doesn't scream when you remove it from the garden. Wear your mole with pride, my friend. And maybe, just maybe, don't hug anyone for a while. Quarantine in the Middle Ages didn't involve polite text messages from your local health department or free home delivery from a wellness app. There was no Netflix, no sourdough trend, no Zoom calls where you pretended to wear pants. No quarantine back then meant someone nailed your door shut from the outside and said good luck in there. We'll check on you if you're still breathing in a few weeks. It wasn't a stay-at-home order, it was a medieval lock-in with extra plague and 0 snacks. Let's set the scene. A plague hits your town. One day you're selling radishes or whatever, and the next your neighbour's skin is turning black and he's bleeding from his eyes. That's not a metaphor that's Tuesday. The town council gets wind of it, and suddenly people are being isolated. And by isolated, we mean forcibly imprisoned inside their homes, with the entire infected family pets, and possibly a confused goose. It wasn't about stopping the spread. It was about sealing the problem away and hoping the smell didn't get too bad. The practice varied slightly depending on where you lived, but the basics were the same. If someone got sick, the whole household was locked inside. Officials or volunteers with a deeply questionable grasp on empathy would hammer wooden boards across the door, sometimes mark it with a red X or a painted cross, and then walk away like they'd just solved a math problem instead of dooming a family to die together. Sometimes they'd leave food, sometimes they'd forget, and sometimes the people inside were perfectly healthy, until they weren't. These quarantine houses became tombs with windows. Passers-by would avoid them like cursed temples. Children would whisper stories. Cats would sit outside and meow dramatically. Inside, people waited. If someone died, the family wasn't allowed to remove the body. They'd just live with it. For days. Maybe weeks. Until the stench made the officials remember, oh right, we nailed that house shut. Then they'd return wearing cloth soaked in vinegar, holding long poles, and carrying that special medieval brand of false hope. Of course you could try to escape. People did. They climbed out of windows, dug tunnels, bribed guards. Some tried to disguise themselves with cloaks or plague masks made out of sad papier-mâché. Others just ran, but getting caught meant punishment, fines, whippings, public humiliation, or being locked back in your death house with extra nails for good measure. The message was clear: die quietly or die louder and get judged for it. Now let's talk about the logic or lack thereof. Quarantine wasn't based on science. It was based on panic. City leaders saw illness as chaos and responded with wood and hammers. No one understood a symptomatic spread. No one knew how long contagion lasted. So they picked a number out of the air, 40 days, 30 days, whatever sounded religious enough, and stuck to it. Hence the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta. Giorni 40 days. Why 40? Because it sounded biblical. That's it. No peer-reviewed studies, just vibes. Whole neighbourhoods could be sealed off, sometimes entire cities. Armed guards patrolled the edges like budget security at a cursed amusement park. Trade stopped. Fear spread. And the sick were left to rot inside shuttered homes while healthy people prayed not to sneeze too loudly. You didn't want to look ill. You didn't want to sound ill. You didn't want to know someone who was ill. Because guilt by association was real and contagious. And here's where it gets darker. In many cases, people were nailed in before they even showed symptoms. Just proximity was enough. Your brother coughed. Congratulations, the whole house is under lockdown. The town crier might even announce it for extra flair. Number 17, the Miller's Lane household is now under quarantine. May God have mercy. Townsfolk would avoid you like the plague because, well, you probably had the plague, or would soon. Either way, you were already halfway dead in the eyes of society. Inside, people did what they could. They prayed. They wept. They rationed stale bread and argued over who got the last onion. If someone survived, they were often shunned afterward anyway. Dirty, marked, haunted by whatever horror had unfolded inside. Survivors might leave town, change their names, become legends. Or they might just curl up and wait for round 2, because plagues had no respect for schedules. Now let's visit the alternatives. If you were rich, you didn't get quarantined, you got to leave. Nobles, merchants, clergy, they packed up their carriages and escaped to countryside estates with cleaner air and fewer dying peasants. They called it retreating. Everyone else called it spreading the disease across 5 counties. The poor, meanwhile, were stuck behind nailed doors with only a dead mole necklace and some expired garlic between them and eternity. But here's the twisted part. Quarantine sometimes worked. Not because people understood virology, but because brute force occasionally resembles strategy. Keeping sick people trapped together did slow the spread, at great cost, with maximum suffering. But it did delay transmission long enough for some towns to avoid total collapse. It was medieval public health through emotional bludgeoning. Flatten the curve, but with planks and a hammer. Of course, not all enforcement was strict. In some towns, quarantined homes bribed their way to freedom. Guards looked the other way. Some officials were just lazy, and some believed that divine fate couldn't be nailed down anyway, so why bother? Meanwhile, rats laughed from the shadows. Fleas giggled on rooftops, and the plague kept doing its thing, relentless, unimpressed, immune to wood. Over time, communities adapted. Market stalls shifted. Religious services moved outdoors. People invented stick-based handshake alternatives. Okay, maybe not, but you know someone tried. Medicine still had no answers, but routine became ritual. People started measuring time in quarantine lengths. How long were you in? Only 2 nailings this year, praise be. It became part of life, morbid, predictable, and just a little too normal. Quarantine evolved into folklore. Songs were written, ballads about lovers separated by locked doors, ghost stories about spirits who couldn't leave their homes even in death. Some believe that if you died during quarantine, your soul wandered the village forever, rattling invisible chains and whispering for bread. Children dared each other to touch the walls of old sealed houses. Superstition grew alongside tragedy, and yet humanity crawled forward. When the next outbreak came, quarantine came too slightly refined, marginally less horrible, but still brutal. People tried new tricks, smoke bombs, scented sachets, whispered Latin, but the core stayed the same. Fear meant isolation. You weren't quarantined to heal, you were quarantined to disappear. So today, when you complain about staying home with Wi-Fi food delivery and a 6-month Netflix backlog, take a breath. You aren't nailed into your house. Your neighbours aren't avoiding you like cursed meat. No one's marking your door with a painted cross and a prayer. You're not stuck. You're safe. And no one's left a dead chicken at your doorstep just in case. By the time your village had reached the everyone is coughing blood and crying phase, there was really only one option left: burn the bodies. Sanitation had failed. Prayer had failed. Dead mole necklaces, goat fat poultices, vinegar foot baths, none of it stopped the plague from spreading like gossip at a church picnic. So what did they do? They turned to fire. If you couldn't save the sick, at least you could keep their corpses from creating new ones. Welcome to the medieval version of disease control, cremation, chaos, and crossed fingers. The death toll rose so quickly during outbreaks, especially the Black Death, that traditional burials became impossible. Graveyards filled up within days. Coffins ran out. Gravediggers quit, got sick, or just plain disappeared. At some point they stopped ringing church bells for the dead because the constant tolling was breaking everyone's morale. You couldn't mourn everyone. You could barely count them. The only thing faster than the dying was the smell. Enter the plague pit, a massive hastily dug trench, meant to swallow dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies at once. No names, no markers, just a pile of the once loved now stacked like firewood. Monks might mutter a few words over the pit, maybe splash a little holy water if they still had the energy. But most of the time the bodies went in silent. If you were lucky, someone closed your eyes. If you weren't, your face just stared at the sky until the dirt covered it. In some cities they burned the bodies instead, mass cremations that turned fields into grim bonfires. Not out of understanding of disease, mind you. It wasn't about bacteria. It was about bad air or miasma. People believed that corpses released a foul vapour that corrupted the living, so burning them was meant to cleanse the air. Funeral meets fumigation. The flames were a kind of desperate prayer made visible. Please let this be the last one. Of course, burning bodies was controversial. The church didn't like it. Cremation wasn't Christian. It smacked of paganism, of something savage. Burial was sacred, ritualistic, symbolic. But when the priest was dead, the bishop was missing, and the congregation was coughing blood rules bent. Holiness gave way to practicality. The bonfires became acceptable, necessary, unavoidable. Not everyone got cremated or buried. In the chaos, many corpses were left in the streets. Some families didn't have the strength to move them. Others feared touching the dead would curse them. Bodies rotted where they fell by hearths in alleyways behind market stalls. Dogs sniffed. Rats feasted. Children learned not to ask about the shapes under sheets. It was horror, not history, and it was everywhere. Authorities tried to maintain order. Town councils issued death protocols. Burn the linens, burn the clothes, burn the house if you have to. If someone died of plague, their entire room was sometimes torched. Windows shattered. Furniture lost. Books incinerated. A lifetime's worth of belongings turned to smoke. The message was clear: nothing is worth keeping if it might kill the next person who touches it. Even funerals changed. No more processions, no choirs, no family gatherings, no eulogies. Sometimes bodies were buried at night to avoid spreading fear. Some were dragged on carts through empty streets wrapped in cloth and doused with vinegar. The sound of wheels over cobblestone became the new hymn: 1 body, 5, 10, an entire street's worth. Just another plague cart doing the Lord's work. And let's talk about the plague carts. They weren't elegant. No ornate woodwork, no flowers, just rough boards, creaky wheels, and the worst smell in the known universe. They were pushed by anyone willing, or anyone desperate enough to get paid. Bring out your dead wasn't just a line from a Monty Python sketch. It was a real cry shouted through the streets day and night. If you didn't bring out your dead, the cart might bring plague to you. Sometimes people were loaded onto those carts still alive. Too weak to move, too sick to protest, they were mistaken for corpses and tossed onto the pile, buried or burned by accident. A twitching hand, a faint moan, a last breath crushed under 10 other bodies. There was no time to check. No one wanted to check. Everyone was afraid, and fear doesn't ask for a second opinion. Desperation led to cruelty. People abandoned loved ones, locked doors, fled towns and never looked back. Mothers left children, husbands left wives. Some people even bribed officials to remove the sick before they were dead just to be safe. Empathy evaporated. Survival was selfish. And no one had the energy to judge. Churches rang their bells less. Clergy stopped visiting homes. Entire orders of monks were wiped out trying to offer last rites. The ones who survived shut their gates. God is everywhere, they said, but we're staying here. Prayer continued, of course. People chanted or lit candles, begged saints. Some whipped themselves in public squares, hoping to draw divine mercy with the sound of flesh on stone. But plague didn't flinch. It just kept going. And yet there was beauty in the madness. Not in the death, but in the tiny acts of stubborn hope. A daughter who stayed beside her mother's bed until the end. A stranger who helped carry a body despite the risk. A monk who sang alone in an empty chapel for souls already gone. These moments flickered in the darkness like candlelight refusing to be smothered. Eventually the fires died out, the pits were filled, the cart stopped rolling, and people stepped cautiously into the sunlight. They didn't celebrate, they just survived. They rebuilt, they planted flowers over the graves, they told stories of what had been lost. And in some places they began to understand maybe disease wasn't punishment, maybe it was just part of life. But for a while, burning the dead was the only thing they could do. Not to save the living, but to mark the end of the suffering. A final scorched line under a chapter written in blood and fear. So they burned, and they prayed, and they hoped it was over, because hope was all they had left. So, you made it. Somehow. After waves of fever, fire, bloodletting leeches, and watching the guy next door get accidentally buried alive, you're still standing. Your skin hasn't turned black. Your lymph nodes haven't exploded. You didn't choke to death on your own lungs as nobody nailed your door shut. What does that mean? Did the dead mole necklace work? Was it the soup, the goat fat? Or hear us out, maybe you were just lucky. Miraculously, gloriously, statistically, bafflingly lucky. Surviving a medieval plague wasn't a medal-worthy achievement. It was more like winning the worst lottery imaginable, your prize guilt trauma, and a mysterious resistance to whatever killed half your village. People didn't understand the immune system. They didn't know about antibodies or T-cells or the glorious invisible dance party happening in your bloodstream. All they knew was that you didn't die, and that made you suspicious, blessed, or possibly dangerous. Survivors weren't exactly celebrated. They were stared at, whispered about, sometimes even avoided. In small communities, surviving when everyone else didn't could earn you an accidental promotion. Suddenly you're the new baker, or the blacksmith, or the midwife, or the priest, if you're literate and slightly more alive than the last guy. There was no application process. Just, you're breathing, you're hired. Whole towns rebuilt themselves on the backs of the lucky and the moderately hygienic. And if you were one of them, congratulations, you now have a job and severe emotional damage. The psychological aftermath was its own disease. They didn't have words like PTSD or survivor's guilt, but they sure had nightmares, isolation, and that lovely 1,000-yard stare. Imagine losing every sibling, neighbour and goat within a month, and still having to wake up and haul water like nothing happened. People laughed less, danced less. Some turned to religion with wild intensity. Others drank themselves into early graves, and a few just walked into the woods one day and didn't come back. Some believed survivors had special blood. Not in a scientific way, more like a superstitious one. You were marked by something, divine favour, a guardian angel, a pact with a saint, or depending on who you asked to deal with the devil. Because let's be honest, when one family of 7 dies and the weird shoeless guy down the road walks away unscathed, someone's going to make up a story about it, usually involving sorcery. In fact, being a survivor during a mass plague could put you on trial. If people got desperate enough, they'd start looking for scapegoats, and who better than the guy who miraculously didn't die? You'd be accused of hoarding holy relics, or poisoning the well, or sleeping too soundly during a crisis. Yes, that was a real accusation. Sleep, guilt, surviving was evidence, burn the witch. But sometimes the opposite happened. You became a walking talisman. People touched you for luck, asked you to bless their bread. They stared into your eyes like maybe your corneas held the cure. He drank from the same cup as his brother and lived. Suddenly you're a legend, or a healer, or the subject of a tavern ballad sung badly by someone 3 ales deep and missing 3 teeth. Communities began recording who lived and who died. Monks scribbled names into ledgers, sometimes with little skulls beside the unlucky ones, and historians today still puzzle over why certain people survived. Some had genetic resistance, especially during the bubonic plague. Others were just less exposed or too poor to afford high-risk lifestyles, like going to church market or public executions. Irony being broke sometimes saved your life. Let's not forget the kids. Many children grew up in the shadow of disease. They didn't remember their mothers, their older siblings, or the before times. All they knew was quiet villages, closed shops, and adults who cried behind doors. They played beside plague pits. They learned to run from sneezing. And they inherited stories soaked in death and whispered over cold stew. Childhood didn't pause for pandemics, it just adapted. But there was something else resilience. Human resilience is a cockroach in chainmail. It survives everything, even when you don't want it to. People laughed again, slowly, awkwardly. Weddings resumed, babies were born, ale flowed, and the market reopened even if it still smelled faintly of despair. Life clawed its way back through the muck because it always does. The living kept living because the dead gave them no other option. Survivors often passed on their stories not as trauma dumps, but as cautionary tales. When I was your age, we buried 10 people a day. Back in the plague years, we drank wine from a skull. Okay, that last one may have been exaggerated, but you get the point. Oral history became survival wisdom. It wasn't science, but it was something. A way to make sense of the senseless. Some survivors even became pseudo-celebrities, travelling healers, self-declared prophets. I survived the Great Sickness, and now I speak to the wind. Villages either adored them or exiled them. Depends on whether their predictions included good harvests or more death. But people were desperate for meaning, and survivors offered the illusion of control. If they lived, maybe I can too. If they know the secret, maybe I can learn it. But most just wanted to be forgotten. They went back to their fields, repaired their roofs, fed their chickens, and tried very hard not to think about the time they dug graves by candlelight for 3 days straight. They didn't write books or build statues. They just endured, quietly, completely, like moss returning to stone. Eventually society stopped asking why people survived. The questions faded, the wounds scabbed over. New wars came, new kings, new plagues. And those who'd endured were just old, sitting by fires, staring into nothing, watching younger generations make the same mistakes. No mole necklaces, maybe, but the same blind hope. And here's the kicker. We still don't fully understand why some people live and others don't. Biology, luck divine roulette. Maybe all of it, maybe none. But the fact remains you, the survivor, carried on. Not because you were better, not because you deserved it, just because. So when you think of medieval survival, don't picture heroes. Picture exhausted farmers, pale midwives, boys with burnt shoes and girls who lost too much. People who didn't ask to be brave, but were anyway, because life demanded it. And they gave it, again and again and again. So, you made it. Somehow. After waves of fever, fire, bloodletting, leeches, and watching the guy next door get accidentally buried alive, you're still standing. Your skin hasn't turned black. Your lymph nodes haven't exploded. You didn't choke to death on your own lungs, and nobody nailed your door shut. What does that mean? Did the dead mole necklace work? Was it the soup the goat fat? Or hear us out, maybe you were just lucky. Miraculously, gloriously, statistically, bafflingly lucky. Surviving a medieval plague wasn't a medal-worthy achievement. It was more like winning the worst lottery imaginable. Your prize-guilt trauma and a mysterious resistance to whatever killed half your village. People didn't understand the immune system. They didn't know about antibodies or T-cells or the glorious invisible dance party happening in your bloodstream. All they knew was that you didn't die, and that made you suspicious, blessed, or possibly dangerous. Survivors weren't exactly celebrated. They were stared at, whispered about, sometimes even avoided. In small communities, surviving when everyone else didn't could earn you an accidental promotion. Suddenly you're the new baker, or the blacksmith, or the midwife, or the priest if you're literate and slightly more alive than the last guy. There was no application process, just you're breathing, you're hired. Whole towns rebuilt themselves on the backs of the lucky and the moderately hygienic. And if you were one of them, congratulations, you now have a job and severe emotional damage. The psychological aftermath was its own disease. They didn't have words like PTSD or survivor's guilt, but they sure had nightmares, isolation, and that lovely 1,000-yard stare. Imagine losing every sibling, neighbour and goat within a month, and still having to wake up and haul water like nothing happened. People laughed less, danced less. Some turned to religion with wild intensity. Others drank themselves into early graves, and a few just walked into the woods one day and didn't come back. Some believed survivors had special blood. Not in a scientific way, more like a superstitious one. You were marked by something. Divine favour, a guardian angel, a pact with a saint, or depending on who you asked to deal with the devil. Because let's be honest, when one family of 7 dies and the weird shoeless guy down the road walks away unscathed, someone's going to make up a story about it. Usually involving sorcery. In fact, being a survivor during a mass plague could put you on trial. If people got desperate enough, they'd start looking for scapegoats, and who better than the guy who miraculously didn't die? You'd be accused of hoarding holy relics, or poisoning the well, or sleeping too soundly during a crisis. Yes, that was a real accusation. Sleep, guilt. Surviving was evidence. Burn the witch. But sometimes the opposite happened. You became a walking talisman. People touched you for luck, asked you to bless their bread. They stared into your eyes like maybe your corneas held the cure. He drank from the same cup as his brother and lived. Suddenly you're a legend, or a healer, or the subject of a tavern ballad sung badly by someone 3 ales deep and missing 3 teeth. Communities began recording who lived and who died. Monks scribbled names into ledgers sometimes with little skulls beside the unlucky ones. And historians today still puzzle over why certain people survived. Some had genetic resistance, especially during the bubonic plague. Others were just less exposed or too poor to afford high-risk lifestyles like going to church market or public executions. Irony being broke sometimes saved your life. Let's not forget the kids. Many children grew up in the shadow of disease. They didn't remember their mothers, their older siblings, or the before times. All they knew was quiet villages, closed shops, and adults who cried behind doors. They played beside plague pits. They learned to run from sneezing, and they inherited stories soaked in death and whispered over cold stew. Childhood didn't pause for pandemics, it just adapted. But there was something else, resilience. Human resilience is a cockroach in chainmail. It survives everything, even when you don't want it to. People laughed again, slowly, awkwardly. Weddings resumed, babies were born, Ull flowed, and the market reopened even if it still smelled faintly of despair. Life clawed its way back through the muck because it always does. The living kept living because the dead gave them no other option. Survivors often passed on their stories not as trauma dumps, but as cautionary tales. When I was your age, we buried 10 people a day. Back in the plague years, we drank wine from a skull. Okay, that last one may have been exaggerated, but you get the point. Oral history became survival wisdom. It wasn't science, but it was something. A way to make sense of the senseless. Some survivors even became pseudo-celebrities, travelling healers, self-declared prophets. I survived the great sickness, and now I speak to the wind. Villages either adored them or exiled them. Depends on whether their predictions included good harvests or more death. But people were desperate for meaning, and survivors offered the illusion of control. If they lived, maybe I can too. If they know the secret, maybe I can learn it. But most just wanted to be forgotten. They went back to their fields, repaired their roofs, fed their chickens, and tried very hard not to think about the time they dug graves by candlelight for 3 days straight. They didn't write books or build statues. They just endured, quietly, completely, like moss returning to stone. Eventually society stopped asking why people survived. The questions faded, the wounds scabbed over. New wars came, new kings, new plagues, and those who had endured were just old, sitting by fires, staring into nothing, watching younger generations make the same mistakes. No mole necklaces, maybe, but the same blind hope. And here's the kicker, we still don't fully understand why some people live and others don't. Biology, luck, divine roulette. Maybe all of it, maybe none. But the fact remains you, the survivor, carried on. Not because you were better, not because you deserved it. Just because. So when you think of medieval survival, don't picture heroes. Picture exhausted farmers, pale midwives, boys with burnt shoes and girls who lost too much. People who didn't ask to be brave but were anyway, because life demanded it. And they gave it. Again and again and again.